Chapter 11. The Miners. I. During World War I 1914–1918, there was a tremendous increase in the U.S. output of coal. The wartime activity in iron, steel, munitions and shipping absorbed much of the increased coal production. An additional demand was created by the closed mines in the war-torn areas of Europe. There was a net increase of about 800 new U.S. mines each year. At the same time, many old mines increased their capacity by the installation of new machinery. High prices and profits drew into the industry more operators, more mines and more miners. The United Mine Workers of America grew to 400,000 members by 1919.1. During the 19,205, the United Mine Workers, then the nation's most powerful union, was engaged in a bitter struggle for survival. Among the critical problems facing the membership was the organization of non-union miners in the southern Appalachian fields, the bituminous coal areas of Kentucky, Tennessee, Alabama and especially West Virginia. The relative decline in the demand for coal as a result of increasing competition from electricity, oil and natural gas, technological changes that enabled the operators to produce the same amount of coal with fewer miners, and the increasing dissatisfaction with the autocratic rule and class collaboration policies of President John L. Lewis and his administration within the United Mine Workers. 2 inches. The miners of America are the most progressive workers in the country, but their officials are among the most reactionary. Thus opened an editorial entitled, "The Struggle in the UMWA," published in the Workers' Monthly of December 1924, calling John L. Lewis a corrupt, class collaborationist tyrant, and a cog in the machine of Calvin Coolidge and the Republican Party. The T.U.E.L paper, R ranked the struggle for Democratic. The Workers' Monthly replaced the Labor Herald. It called itself official organ of the Workers' Party and the Trade Union Educational League, thus closely identifying the League with the Communist Party. 208. Honest, militant leadership in the miners' union among the most important in the entire American labor movement. 3. The Lewis Machine. John L. Lewis was born in 1880 of a Welsh mining family in Lucas, Iowa, a coal mining community. Between 1897 and 1901, Lewis worked as a farm hand and coal miner. He then left the family home to wander in the mountainous west, from which he returned to Lucas late in 1905 to once again mine coal. However, he refused to settle into the life of a miner, instead taking over the management of the local theater. In 1907 he ran for mayor of Lucas, but lost. That same year he joined a grain and feed business. It failed. He speculated in the grain market and lost. But he married, above him, to Myrta Bell, a physician's daughter. In 1908 Lewis and his wife moved to Panama, Illinois, a coal company town with a strong local of the UMW, one of the 10 largest in the state. They were followed by the rest of the Lewises. A year later, John's brother, Thomas, became a police magistrate. In 1910 John became president of the union local. From that time on, he never again entered the mines as a worker. He resigned the local post in 1911 to become special organizer for AFL President Samuel Gompers. He was succeeded as local union president by Thomas, who was at the same time manager of the coal mine that employed the union members. The Lewis family, as Melvin Dubofsky and Warren Van Tyne make clear in their biography of John L. Lewis, enriched themselves at the expense of the union members. A later investigation uncovered a pattern of corruption and embezzlement whereby Tom and Denny, as well as their father, Thomas H., maintained a dual set of books, issued illegal checks, and forged checks to double the expenditures approved by the local union. Despite this, John L. Lewis never criticized or dissociated himself from his brothers. In his quest for power in the labor movement, Lewis relied entirely on corruption. Wherever possible, Dubofsky and Van Tyne point out, Lewis used influence, voters and power he controlled in the large union local to inveigle patronage appointments from UMW superiors rather than run for office and face a union electorate. 4. From the beginning he was involved in election fraud. From 1911 to 1918 he never ran for office, yet his rise to power was phenomenal. In June 1915, UMW President John White appointed Lewis as Union statistician, undoubtedly in payment for his support. Lewis engaged in electoral shenanigans worthy of the most cunning of big city bosses. On July 15, 1917, White appointed Lewis as business manager of the United Mine Workers Journal, a powerful position from which he could influence the thinking of the Union miners. A short time later, White resigned as UMW president to join the wartime fuel administration and was succeeded by Vice President Frank J. Hayes, an amiable, ineffectual dipsomaniac, who had no heart for the routine work connected with the job of chief executive. Hayes appointed Lewis as vice president, but with the president continuously drunk, Lewis completely took over the Union. On February 6, 1920, Hayes resigned and Lewis was confirmed by the UMW Executive Board as president. Thus, Lewis had moved to the top of the UMW but had presented himself for approval by the membership only once. 5. At this time the formal organization of the UMW was based on locals, composed of from 20 to 500 members each, with the several thousand locals grouped into 25 districts, and these districts unified into an international government which consisted of president, one vice president, one secretary-treasurer, minor offices, the administrative staff and an executive board. While it appeared on the surface that an adequate amount of democratic machinery was available to make these officials responsible to the Union membership, the truth is that the UMW's constitution placed no restriction on the president's activities as long as he asserted and maintained the power of interpreting its meaning and application. To be sure, issues were supposed to be settled by majority vote at the conventions to ensure that the will of the Union's rank and file members prevailed. But here, too, the power of the president was decisive. Basically, work at the UMW conventions was conducted by committees, and the committees were appointed almost exclusively by the president. He had complete control over the Credentials Committee, which decided who should be admitted to the convention, the Committee on Agenda, which decided which subjects the convention would take up, and the committees which recommended to the convention exactly the resolutions on various subjects that the president favored. 6. The president could and did manipulate parliamentary procedure to make sure that the actions he favored were approved on the convention floor. During the 1920 convention, Lewis refused to recognize a motion from the floor, and when asked whether the convention was to be ruled by parliamentary law or not, he replied, "Yes, but before parliamentary law comes the rule of reason." Soon Lewis discarded even the rule of reason, and ran UMW conventions as it suited him. He recognized only those whom he wished to speak, closed the debate when he wished, had objectors forcibly thrown out, and in general disregarded the desires of protesting delegates, no matter how many. To those who objected, he thundered, "May the chair state that you may shout until you meet each other in hell and he will not change his ruling." 7. The control over their own affairs, stipulated in the Constitution as belonging to the districts and locals, was also greatly curtailed in practice. The formation of districts was largely under the control of international officers who could arrange these subdivisions with considerable latitude in order to carry out their policies. New locals were created by union organizers who owed their jobs to the president. The election of organizers, Lewis argued, would reduce efficiency. 8. Lewis exercised control over districts and locals through his power to suspend or revoke the charter of any group within the Union for any reason and for as long a period as he saw fit, subject only to the approval of the Executive Board. Any district or local that opposed him found itself under a kind of martial law, with the regularly elected officers replaced by emergency officers appointed solely by the president. These provisional officers took over and reorganized the group with the help of field workers, and continued to govern as long as Lewis so desired. 9. Through the use of provisionalism, Lewis prevented the emergence of other important candidates for his position by liquidating potential rivals in the local and district administrations. His control over credentials and discussions in the convention was the second line of defense against his opponents. 10. A number of other provisions served to secure the president's complete control over the Union. First, he controlled the Union's official publication through the executive board, and during the 19,205 the journal was turned into a banal house organ, devoted chiefly to Lewis' life and works. 11. Secondly, centralization of Union finances gave Lewis control over the purse strings and left little official funds for opposition groups to use to promote their causes. The administration was also able to influence members of the Union by the use of the patronage at its disposal. Technically, the rank and file had the right to use the recall, under which an officer might be forced to stand the test of another vote if enough of the members were dissatisfied with his administration. But the machinery was difficult to employ. 5% of all the members had to sign the initial petition for the recall of an officer, and 30% had to sign a second petition within 30 days in order to force a new vote on the official involved. 12 In a union of 500,000 members, it was exceedingly difficult, if not impossible, to obtain 150,000 signatures in a short time, particularly in view of the fact that opposition members had to finance the procedure themselves and that the instigation of such action was likely to result in expulsion from the Union. 13 Under the Union's constitution, the president had the power to suspend or revoke the membership of any individual or group within the Union, for any reason and for as long as he saw fit. Lewis consolidated his power by fraud, bribery and corruption. He usurped from the districts the right to elect their officers and appointed his henchmen as officials. He created an army of gunmen and gangsters. The 1920 National Convention put the finishing touches on the dictatorship when it gave him authority to expel Union members, revoke charters of the subdivisions and local unions, and set up his own organization in their place. This, as Spencer D. Pollard notes in his study of democracy in the government of the United Mine Workers, enabled Lewis to establish a tight, monolithic dictatorship. But it did not eliminate resistance. Because of his actions in ending the Great Coal Strike of 1919, which we examined in Volume 8, Lewis faced strong opposition within the Union. In spite of an injunction issued by Federal Judge A. B. Anderson of Indianapolis at the request of Attorney General A. Mitchell Palmer, ordering the UMW officials to call off any strike, 400,000 miners went on strike November 1, 1919. For a 60% increase in pay, a 6-hour day, and a 5-day week. Judge Anderson issued the final injunction on November 8, giving the Union 72 hours in which to cancel the strike. Lewis chose to capitulate. He made no attempt to resist the injunction, held no referendum, and did not even announce the terms under which the miners should go back to work. The terms, when finally disclosed, provided for an immediate wage increase of 14%, and left the disposition of all other questions to the judgment of a commission to be appointed by President Woodrow Wilson. After holding extended hearings, the commission granted less than half of the miners' demands. The coal diggers obtained a 27% wage increase, but the demands for a Gower day and 5-day week were ignored. Illinois miners demanded that the international leadership take immediate action either to renegotiate the Washington Agreement, or to declare it non-binding. Because of the extensive cooperation between recently installed International President John L. Lewis and the federal government over coal policy during the war, the insurgents also denounced the UMW leadership as the apologist for and the beneficiaries of a capitalist system that is now in crisis. 15 inches like a pusillanimous poltroon, wrote one critic of Lewis, he betrayed the rank and file, obeyed the injunction and cowered behind the skirts of Americanism. 16. The last phrase related to Lewis' explanation in calling off the strike that, we are Americans. We cannot fight the government. John Walker, leader of District 12, Illinois, told Mother Jones that Lewis, surrendering and bowing in abject submission, allowing the men to be driven into the mines like cattle, without a fight at all makes the decent mine workers, who understand what it means, blush with shame. L7. In 1920, dissension mounted among rank-and-file miners in the Pennsylvania anthracite districts over the contracting system used by the operators. Under the system, the coal companies rented out parts of their mines to contractors, each of whom was free to make up his own labor force from non-union sources. Apart from the fact that this represented competition of cheaper labor, union miners complained that the contractors were awarded the richest working places in the mines and that whenever there was a shortage of empty coal cars, preference was given to the contractors. They also complained that the coal companies used the threat of substituting contract for union work to force the union men to make concessions which violated the union agreement with the operators. 18. Lewis declined to intervene in the controversy. In the summer of 1920, in order to avoid a direct violation of the union agreement, the miners of District 1, the area most affected by the contracting system, under the leadership of Rinaldo Capellini, took a simultaneous vacation from work to force some recognition of their grievances. At the peak of the walkout, 135,000 miners were on vacation, but the vigorous efforts of the government and the Lewis administration broke the strike after several weeks. 19. A year later, the seething discontent over the contracting issue took the form of a rebellion against the administration's candidates for office in District 1. Despite every device employed by the Lewis machine to prevent it, Capellini, the leader of the vacation strike, was elected president of the district by the disgruntled miners. 20. But Lewis now employed another one of his strategies to squelch dissent. He simply bought off Capellini. As soon as he was installed as a member of the official oligarchy, Capellini became an ardent and aggressive Lewis supporter. 21. But the contracting issue did not die. In 1924, over strong opposition from Capellini, a general grievance committee led a walkout of 30,000 miners in the Wilkes-Barre area to protest against the contracting system and other grievances. The strike was finally suppressed by international headquarters, but before it was ended, Lewis had expelled 12,000 members from the union. 22. Elected UMW president in December 1920 as a conservative, John L. Lewis was, strangely enough, the progressive candidate opposing Gompers' re-election as AFL president in 1921. But as one historian has pointed out, Lewis was not the person to rally progressive opposition. 23. As a convention delegate from the Chicago Federation of Labor noted, it was not a fight along clear-cut lines. Mr. Lewis, posing as the radical or progressive candidate on a progressive platform, was neither radical nor progressive. He reported that progressives in the UMW refused to support Lewis, casting 1,596 votes for Gompers. 24. For his part, Gompers effectively attacked Lewis as being dominated by the Hearst newspapers. Gompers won re-election, by a vote of 25,022 to 12,324, with 947 not voting. 25. The Miners' Program, a class-conscious working-class movement with a clear political program, emerged among bituminous coal miners in the post-World War I period, writes Alan J. Singer in his study of ideological conflict in the UMW. 26. The program was originally laid down by the 1919 Cleveland UMW Convention. It proposed nationalization of the coal industry and the 6-hour day and 5-day week. But in 1921, District 2, Central Pennsylvania, already emerging as a center of rank-and-file activism, appealed. That program will remain a pious hope and a vague aspiration until the rank-and-file know what the program means, why it is needed here and now, and how to get it. That means that the discussion in miners' locals must center around the program. Our challenge to the present basis of the coal industry is this: the private ownership of the great natural resource of coal is morally indefensible and economically unsound. It means that coal is mined for the comparatively few owners, instead of the use and service of the public. It results in chronic mismanagement of the mines. It results in exploitation of the miner through overwork, underpay, inadequate safeguards, bad housing, accidents, and long and unnecessary periods of enforced idleness. It results in unemployment when millions of consumers need coal. It results in high prices for coal when democratic methods of production would reduce cost, increase production, and give a good American life to the miners. The Miners' Program could be progressively enacted inside of a few years if the miners willed it. It was not enough for the miners to will it. It was also necessary to wrest control of the UMW from John L. Lewis and his henchmen. While they occasionally gave lip service to the miners' program, basically they were committed to cooperation between the union and the operators and to stifling and ousting any elements in the union who opposed such cooperation. 27. As President John L. Lewis consolidated his position as chief executive officer of the UMW in the early 19,205, he became more and more dictatorial in asserting the authority of the LNT Amational in Indianapolis and less mindful of the rights of industrial or subdistrict officials who challenged his decisions. Thus, in August 1921, District 12 President Frank Farrington wrote an article for the United Mine Workers Journal which was devoted to a description of the reasons for celebrating Labor Day. It was rejected for publication. Upon inquiring why, the editor informed Pose. Farrington protested this decision at the 1921 convention of the UMW, but to no avail. It was partly as a result of this censorship that District 12 established its own journal, the Illinois Miner, early in 1922 which, for a time at least, reflected the opinions of the rank-and-file members more accurately than the official journal of the UMW. 28. Role of Alexander Howitt. At the UMW convention in September 1921, Lewis faced a coalition of opponents. Known as the Big Four, they included Frank Farrington and John Walker of District 12, Illinois, Alexander Howitt of District 14, Kansas, and Robert Harlan of District 10, Washington. While the Big Four were united in opposition to John L. Lewis and his international henchmen, they held radically different trade union views. Frank Farrington was a pure and simple business trade unionist who shared Lewis' trade union philosophy of collaboration with the coal operators, but opposed the UMW president because of his own political ambition. John Walker and Robert Harley were socialists and union politicians. Although they argued against Lewis' policies and endorsed a platform calling for a campaign to organize unorganized mines, the formation of a labor party to advance the interests of the working class, and called for government intervention in the bituminous coal industry and possible nationalization of the mines, they sacrificed principles and made political deals with the business unionists in order to gain office. Furthermore, Walker, a former president of the Illinois District, and president of the Illinois State Federation of Labor, frequently made deals with Farrington. He saw an opportunity in Illinois to help stifle rank-and-file militancy on a number of occasions. 29. Alexander Howitt, a socialist, of UMW District 14, Kansas, on the other hand, was bent on ending the dictatorship in the Union and make it serve the interests of the membership rather than those of Lewis and his machine. Howitt rejected the concept of the sanctity of the contract, arguing that the willingness to strike was the miners' principal weapon. After World War I, rank-and-file resentment, pent up by a wartime no-strike pledge, exploded in a series of wildcat strikes, and then a national strike in violation of a federal injunction that neither the districts nor the national office could control. While Farrington appealed to Lewis for the Trade Union Educational League was not yet part of the coalition against Lewis. Not until late 1922, at a T.U.E.L conference in Chicago, was the mining program presented. It called for an alliance between railroad workers and miners, the lack of which weakened both unions, the negotiation of national rather than district agreements, the organization of unorganized miners, and the direct election of organizers. Labor Herald, September 1922, p. 22. C. Philip S. Foner, History of the Labor Movement in the United States 8, 141-146. Authority to suspend membership rights of wildcat strikers. Asterisk. Howitt supported the Illinois Wildcatters and led strikes in violation of the contract in Kansas. 30. Although Howitt has been treated as inept and a drunkard by Melvin Dubofsky and Warren Van Tyne in their biography of John L. Lewis, they concede that, at his best, he exemplified the militancy, flavor, and courage of rank-and-file miners. 31. Born in Glasgow, Scotland, in 1876, Alexander Howitt came with his parents to the United States in 1879, finally settling in Crawford County. Kansas. He began his first work in the mines at the age of 10, and in 1902 he was elected a board member of the Miners' Union of District 14. In 1906 he was elected to the presidency of District 14 and served until 1914, when he refused to stand for re-election because of a charge that he had accepted bribes from the operators. According to McAllister Coleman, the rank and file never questioned Howitt's honesty or his militancy. The charge was proved false, and Howitt was re-elected in 1916.32. During the 1919 coal strike, Howitt and District 14 stood firm and criticized Lewis for capitulating. In 1920, the Kansas legislature passed the notorious law creating a Court of Industrial Relations designed to enforce compulsory arbitration and prevent strikes in labor disputes. Howitt was bitterly opposed to the law, calling it unconstitutional, and he notified the miners that the law would be ignored and fought. 90% of the Kansas miners walked out when Howitt and other district officials were arrested for defiance of the industrial court law. Howitt's defiance led to his being sent to jail, along with August Dorchy, Secretary-Treasurer of District 14. The jury informed the public. We find the defendant guilty, but we are of one mind that the industrial court law is not a good law and recommend that it be taken from the statute books. We do not feel that Howitt and Dorchy committed a crime in calling the strike in this particular case. 33*. Howitt was in and out of jail for almost 3 years for defying the anti-labor law. They used to say you can't keep a good man down. When Farrington removed the charters of the 24 locals whose members had participated in the Wildcat strike, several Peoria, 111, locals sent a joint telegram to district headquarters in Springfield, which they addressed to His Royal Highness Lord Farrington and members of the imperial family. Their answer was that he could go to hell and take the charter with you, for may we not advise you to get passports to Holland and join our friend Bill Hohenzollern, for the miners will not stand for the organization being Kaiserized any longer. Sylvia Copeland, Rebellion in Labor Unions, New York, 1924 p. 117. The reference to Bill Hohenzollern concerns the former Kaiser Wilhelm II of Germany, who was granted residence in Holland after Germany's defeat in 1918. In July 1922, William Allen White, the famous editor and publisher of the Emporia, Kansas Gazette, was arrested for violating the Industrial Court Act when he placed a placard in the Gazette's window announcing his sympathy for the striking railroad workers. Advance. August 4, 1922. Editorialized advance. Soon we have to change it in the case of Alexander. Howitt too, you can't keep a good man out of jail. 34 While he was in prison, strikes in defiance of the law continued to spread. The Coal Operators Association in Kansas appealed to the International Union to force the miners back to work in compliance with the contract. Instead of rallying to Howitt's aid, Lewis and the International Executive Board agreed with the mine operators that the UMW contract had been violated, removed Howitt and other District 14 officials from office, and replaced them with their own appointees. 83. Kansas locals who remained loyal to Howitt were also expelled from the Union, causing large numbers of Union members to lose their jobs. Lewis justified his action with the argument that he was acting in response to pleas from Kansas miners who wanted relief from Howitt's ruinous administration. The miners of Kansas, Lewis cried, shall not be permitted to be sacrificed to the whims and caprices of a demagogue. But a study of the dispute concluded that Howitt had wide support, not only in Kansas but throughout the Union. In 1920, as the anti-administration candidate for vice president, he had received 132,416 votes against the administration candidate's 145,452.35. Howitt had the support of progressive trade unionists throughout the country, and no more so than in Illinois' District 12. As John H. N. Laslett notes in his study of District 12. The Illinois radicals did all they could to help Howitt, while at the same time using him as a weapon in their own struggle against Lewis. They donated $100,000 from the district treasury to help Howitt carry on his legal battle, and provided financial aid to many individual Kansas miners who had lost their jobs as a result of the dispute. In addition, the Illinoisans agreed by referendum vote to assess themselves $1 per month in additional financial support until the dispute was over. They did this despite strong opposition from the International, which had declared the Howitt administration a dual organization in opposition to the officers that Lewis had appointed to replace it, and despite rumored threats that if District 12 persisted in its support for the Howitt faction, Lewis would lift their charter. 2.36. Mary Heaton Vorse, who visited Howitt while he was in jail, remarked that there was something in his fighting spirit that even jail could not touch. 37. In that spirit, Howitt defied Lewis' order to send the men back to the pits. The International president then appointed 3 members of his executive board to make a thorough investigation of conditions in Kansas. The committee studied the situation and, since they were all Lewis, at every mine workers' convention in the early 19,205, the Howitt Affair, as it was known, and his appeals for reinstatement were used by militants as powerful weapons in their attacks on Lewis and his increasingly despotic machine. Howitt emerged as a champion of the rank and file, local autonomy, and the right to strike. Henchman presented a report sustaining Lewis' contention that the miners were on strike in violation of contract and recommending a resumption of work in compliance with the agreement. Howitt was then ordered to appear before the International Executive Board. Nothing was said by Lewis and his executive board about the Kansas Industrial Court. 38. The District 14 leader refused to obey the executive board's decree and Lewis brought the matter before the UMW International Convention in September 1921. He asked the convention to sustain the International Executive Board's action. For almost a week, the delegates debated the proposition. Howitt's supporters contended that the adoption of Lewis' recommendation would constitute taking sides with the operators against the miners. Although Illinois, Indiana, and Kansas voted for Howitt, the Lewis machine was able to overwhelm their votes, and its recommendation was adopted by a final vote of 2,753 to 1,781. Despite Howitt's defeat, the 1921 UMW convention at Indianapolis was marked by several signs of progress. This included evidence of the growing revolt of the rank and file. As a result, in its final days the convention made several advances. The most important single accomplishment by the progressives was the mine nationalization resolution. This reaffirmed the miners' endorsement of public ownership at the Cleveland Convention 2 years before. It declared that the natural resources, particularly timber and coal, were being despoiled under a system of production which wasted from 33 to 50% of these resources for the sake of maximum dividends, and it held that the coal supply of our nation should be owned by the Commonwealth and operated in the interest of and for the use and comfort of all the people in the Commonwealth. The resolution demanded immediate nationalization of the coal industry of the United States and instructed the international officers of the Union to prepare a bill for the purchase of all coal properties at a figure representing actual valuation of these properties, and for the operation of the mines by governmental commissions on which the mine workers would be given equal representation. It further instructed the Union officers to appoint a committee to prepare a report showing the savings of public ownership, and to carry on a campaign of education on nationalization among all people whose support was necessary to achieve this goal. Lewis appointed a progressive committee to draw up a nationalization statement. The chairman was the outstanding figure in the fight for nationalization, John Brophy, president of the 45,000 coal miners in District No. 2 in central Pennsylvania. The other 2 members were William Mitch, as president of District 2, Brophy had drawn up the miners' program. Approved by the district convention in February 1921, the program advanced nationalization of the mines. Secretary-Treasurer of District 11 in the Central Competitive Field, and Christopher J. Golden, president of District 9. The appointment of the committee, with power to use the columns of the United Mine Workers Journal, and to spend funds of the Union in an educational campaign gave encouragement to the rank-and-file progressives. A score of resolutions were also passed in favor of the freedom of all political prisoners, self-determination of Russia and Ireland, the formation of a new political party combining forces of organized labor and the organized farmers, and requesting Samuel Gompers to call a conference of labor unions and farmers to effect this purpose. Among the actions of the convention was the selection of Alexander Howitt as a delegate to the International Miners Conference to be held in 1922 in Europe. At the previous international convention, attended by delegates from every important country in the world, plans were formulated for the calling of an international miners' strike in case of threat of war. The Congress also urged nationalization of mines and other public industries. Howitt would have no power to commit the American miners to international action for the prevention of war, but his selection guaranteed that the miners in the United States would hear a good deal about this issue on his return. 39. The selection of Howitt to represent the United Mine Workers abroad did not signify the cessation of the battle between the Kansas miners and John L. Lewis. While the Kansas miners, supported by the Illinois district, continued in a state of rebellion against the international officers, Lewis proceeded to liquidate his adversary. On October 12, 1921, he suspended the Kansas district's charter, ousted Howitt and other district officials and named provisional officers to reorganize the unit. When the miners were arrested and jailed for battling the scabs authorized by Lewis to break their strike, their wives and daughters took over the picket lines, and fought the state militia for the right to replace their husbands and fathers. When Van A. Bidner, Lewis' henchman, condemned the women pickets, they published a scathing reply in the Pittsburgh Kansas Press. The leaders of the in a 30-hour week to unify and stabilize the coal industry in the public interest. It stressed the need for education and research in order to accomplish this goal. District 2, UMWA. Proceedings of the Special Convention, February 22–25, 1921, pp. 32–36, 38–41, 43–73, 80 C-list. Review. April–May 1921, pp. 43–44, Sister M. Camilla Mulle, 0. P. John Brophy. Militant labor leader and reformer. The CLO Years, Ph.D. dissertation. Catholic University of America, 1966, p. 17. Essentially District 2's, the Miners Program, followed the Militant Miners Program, passed over Lewis' opposition at the 1919 UMWA Convention. This had been widely publicized in the district. John Brophy, A. Miners. Life, ed. John O. P. Hull, Madison, 1964, pp. 111–22, L. 78–212, Alan Singer, Which Side Are You On? Ideological Conflict in the United Mine Workers of America, 1919–1928, unpublished Ph.D. Dis. Rutgers University, 1982, pp. 133–69, 211–24. The 1919 UMW Convention instructed the LNT Executive Board to draw up a bill for presentation to Congress providing for government acquisition of all coal properties in the United States. Women picketeers were promptly arrested without a word of protest from Bittner. The miners who continued the strike were expelled from the union by Lewis' order. New local unions were organized to replace those whose charters had been revoked. Howitt's local union lost its charter, and the international officers held that Howitt was therefore no longer a member of the United Mine Workers. 40. Howitt and 125 of his suspended followers came to the 1922 International Union Convention. The militant Kansan forced his way onto the platform and demanded that his appeal from the action of the international officials be heard. Lewis interrupted him and declared he was not entitled to any consideration as he was not a delegate or even a member of the union. The president insisted that the convention consider only wage matters and ruled that Howitt's appeal to the delegates to consider reinstating the deposed Kansas officials and locals out of order. When a storm of protest broke out, Lewis permitted a debate on whether Howitt could appeal the chair's ruling to the convention. It was in an effort on Howitt's behalf that 92-year-old Mother Jones made her farewell speech to a United Mine Workers Convention. She had traveled to Kansas to organize and speak in support of Howitt, and she had organized a movement for Howitt to be released from jail on bond so that he could attend the UMW convention. 42 During the vote on whether to grant Howitt a hearing on his expulsion, Mother Jones interrupted the proceedings. She did not ask permission to speak but walked quietly up to the front of the stage and held up her hand, wrote a correspondent. Absolute quiet prevailed as she remonstrated with her boys. She begged her beloved coal diggers to save the Kansas Miners' Union, to quit fighting among themselves. 43 And she told the delegates, "I have known Alex Howitt for 20 years, and while I have not always agreed with Alex, I want to make this statement to the audience and to the world, that my desire is to have 1,000,000 Alex Howitts in the nation to fight the battle of the workers. He has fought for his men and he has fought the damnable law that the governor of Kansas put on the statute books to enslave the workers. He fought it nobly and he is willing to go to death for it, and because he did it he was put in jail and denounced. If Alex Howitt never did anything else he called attention of the nation to that slave law. I don't feel very much like talking today, but here is one woman who, if I stand alone, I will stand behind Alex Howitt for the fighting qualities he has and for the manhood he has shown." The convention was in wild disorder while the case was being discussed. When the chair called for a rising vote, the Howitt supporters won. However, the administration forces succeeded in obtaining a roll call vote, and Lewis' ruling was sustained by a narrow margin amid stormy scenes verging on rioting. 45. Howitt returned to jail in Kansas after the convention, and when he was granted his freedom after serving nearly 3 years, he immediately began a joint struggle for reinstatement and against the policies of the Lewis administration. In his battle against Lewis, he endorsed the program of the T.U.E.L and had its full support, as well as that of the Workers' Communist Party. At a meeting of the Red L.N.T.E.M. Committee on February 11, 1922, William Z. Foster, its secretary, called the Howitt case the supreme fighting issue in the battle against the Lewis machine, and reported that, with the support of the T.U.E.L, a movement is now on foot to impeach Lewis for his arbitrary and unconstitutional handling of the Howitt case. 46. Howitt had high respect for the T.U.E.L and William Z. Foster. In an article in the Labor Herald entitled, "How I Became a Rebel," Howitt wrote of the T.U.E.L, "I am for it. Foster is doing great work. The T.U.E.L has got hold of a big idea. The best fighters in the trade unions are naturally radical and progressive. When they learn to organize and act in one body in the unions, a new day will dawn for American labor." 47. The movement that was on foot, according to Foster, was temporarily postponed by an unusual event that occurred in the coal industry on April 1, 1922. Rarely did the miners in both branches of the industry, bituminous and anthracite, walk out at the same time. Their negotiations and contracts were entirely separate. But in 1922, not only did the miners in the unionized bituminous fields walk out, but so, too, did the union miners in the anthracite coal fields of Pennsylvania. What is more, many of the miners in the major non-union fields, especially Somerset, Fayette, and Westmoreland counties in Pennsylvania, joined the walkout. Over 600,000 coal miners left work on April 1, 1922, or shortly thereafter, in the largest coal miners' strike in United States history. The fields of West Virginia and Alabama, however, were scarcely touched by the strike. Before discussing the great 1922 strike, it is important to understand the reasons for this situation. West Virginia. World War I brought great prosperity in West Virginia, especially in the Logan County mines. But the industrial peonage that had provoked the Cabin Creek Paint Creek strike of 1912-13 still prevailed. Wages had not. Bituminous, or soft coal, was primarily an industrial fuel, while anthracite, or hard coal, was a household fuel. See Philip S. Foner, History of the Labor Movement in the United States 5, New York, 1980, 182-95. Kept up by any means with the increase in the cost of living. Miners were still paid in scrip, good only at company stores. They still worked 10, 12, and 14 hours a day. Their villages were still policed by armed thugs recruited by the Baldwin-Felts strikebreaking agency, especially in Mingo, McDowell, and Mercer counties. In Logan County, Sheriff Don Chafin had replaced Baldwin-Felts' men with his own army of deputies paid by the coal companies. Miners still lived in camps where the company-owned dwellings were, in the words of the U.S. Coal Commission, old, unpainted board and batten houses, batten going or gone and board fast following, roofs broken, porches sagging, a riot of rubbish, and a medley of odors. Organizers still took their lives in their hands in counties where employers still preferred to deal only with the Baldwin-Felts Detective Agency instead of the UMW. The whole territory, Philip Murray, UMW vice president, declared after a visit to West Virginia, with thousands of inhabitants, is absolutely under the control of the operators. The individual is Hope 1S. 8 in the notorious Hitchman 1917 ruling, upholding the Yellow Dog contract, the Supreme Court added to that hopelessness. Testimony before the United States Senate Committee on Education and Labor disclosed that largely through holding companies and interlocking directorates, the companies controlling certain West Virginian non-union mines, namely the U.S. Steel Corporation and the Pennsylvania Railroad, also controlled the coal industry. The labor policies for the non-union mines were directed by U.S. Steel and the Pennsylvania Railroad, both controlled by the House of Morgan. In 1919, the miners in Mingo County decided that they had had enough, and they applied to the local United Mine Workers for a charter. When all the miners who were identified as supporting the move were discharged and evicted from the company houses, a bloody series of strikes followed in Logan, Mingo, McDowell, and Mercer counties. The mine operators immediately dispatched contingents of their private detectives, armed to the teeth with revolvers and Winchester rifles, to conduct a war against the new Union members. This private army proceeded to ferret out all the organizers and active members of the Union and to evict them and their families from the mining company properties. Union organizers were beaten up and thrown out of the district. But the miners informed the public, "We are going to organize these fields regardless of the opposition. Men are beaten and jailed because they have dared to ask for their constitutional rights, and get them we will." 49. Late in August 1919, Union miners in the Kanawha fields, enraged by these assaults, began a march over the mountains to Logan and Mingo counties, where they hoped to shut down the non-union mines and break the iron grip of Sheriff Chafin. While some of the marchers returned home before they advanced very far, the bulk of them, 5,000 strong, and most of them armed, crossed over into Boone County. There they were confronted by Governor John J. Cromwell, who threatened them with federal troops and charges of treason if they crossed into Logan County. This threat had the desired effect. The marchers disbanded and were brought to Charleston by special trains. The governor boasted to the press that he had broken up a deliberate plan to discard the work of Washington and Jefferson, of Madison and Monroe, of Lincoln, of Cleveland, of Roosevelt, and substitute the ideas of Karl Marx, or Nikola Lenin and Leon Trotsky. 5 degrees. Assisted by the governor, gunmen continued to raid Union halls in the southern counties. One of their main targets was Mattawan, on the Kentucky border. Mattawan was known as the home of the Hatfields and McCoys. These two families had been shooting at each other for years, but their bloody feud was ended by unionism. The Hatfields and McCoys joined the UMW and were striking together when Albert Felts, head of the Baldwin-Felts Agency, came to Mattawan with 11 armed agents to evict those miners who had joined the strike. Young Sid Hatfield, the Mattawan sheriff, and himself a former miner, refused to do the evicting, hence the influx of gunmen. When the Baldwin-Felts gunmen appeared, Sheriff Hatfield deputized 12 men to defend the town. A McCoy was one of these men. A battle broke out between the miners and the gunmen. When it was over and the smoke had cleared, 3 townsmen, including the mayor, and 7 gunmen were dead. Among them were Albert and Lee Felts, the strike-breaking chiefs. The Mattawan Massacre, of May 19, 1920, sparked further violence, and during July and August, more than 40 men died in Mingo County alone. 51. Hatfield and other miners were charged with murder. I entered one of the trials of the Mattawan defenders, Art Shields, veteran labor reporter, recalled, in a little courtroom, where the judge sat with his back to the court and his feet on each side of the open door. All visitors, including two U.S. senators, were frisked from ankle to neck. But the real drama was the futile attempt of the Coal Trust to wrest a guilty verdict from the jury. After a 2-month trial, Hatfield and the other miners were acquitted of the Mattawan murders for lack of evidence. On August 1, 1921, however, Hatfield was assassinated by Mine Guard deputies. 52. Hatfield's murder triggered a second march on Logan, Sid Hatfield. Art Shields wrote, was a popular hero, and men grabbed rifles all over the state. Volunteers from Ohio and Pennsylvania were among them. Many Negroes were marching. It was a sudden, spontaneous uprising. Coal trains were commandeered, and several thousand men were deep in enemy territory. Mattawan, a film about the Coalfield War in the West Virginia during 1920-21, written and directed by John Sayles, made its appearance on the screen in August 1987. Tory when I arrived before Labor Day, 1921. Their objective was Logan City. This was the main anti-Union stronghold. It was ruled by Sheriff Don Chafin, who was known as the Millionaire Gunman. He had personally killed a dozen men, the New York World reported. Logan County, which Don Chafin ruled, has been described by Winthrop D. Lane as a leer in the face of liberty, a feudal barony defended by soldiers of fortune in the pay of mine owners. 53. A congressional investigation of conditions in West Virginia was in progress, but the Union miners were unwilling to wait for the results. They began arming themselves and gathered in large numbers for the march into Logan County. It soon became clear that this time the operators were not going to rely on private gunmen and state militia to beat back the marchers. Their new ally was President Warren G. Harding in the White House. Brigadier General Henry Bandholtz arrived in Marmot and warned the miners that they would face federal troops if they moved further, and that the White House had sent him to demand that they disband and return home. 54. Mother Jones, the aged, miner's angel, veteran of many miners' battles and those of other workers, joined the marchers at Marmot and at first encouraged the angry miners. 55. However, when the march threatened to get underway involving at least 5,000 armed miners and thousands of defenders on the other side, she reversed her stand. She addressed the miners at Marmot and told them that she had a telegram from President Harding requesting that the miners abandon your purpose and return to your homes, and I assure you that my good offices will be used to forever eliminate the gunmen from the state of West Virginia. The telegram was signed, Warren G. Harding, President of this great republic. However, it was actually a bogus message made up by Mother Jones, who had reached the conclusion that the march would end in tragedy for the armed miners, and had joined the procession simply to turn them back. Asterisk. The Union officials asked Mother Jones to allow them to see the telegram, but she refused. The officials then telegraphed to Washington and received a reply from President Harding's secretary that the president had not sent any such telegram to Mother Jones, and they so informed a committee of the miners' army. This exposure of her deception seriously injured Mother Jones's influence with the miners. 56. Although the urgings of other Union leaders temporarily halted the march on Logan, it was resumed after a week. Meanwhile, Men and Boys, in his autobiography Art Shields writes that Mother Jones had good reason to fear that the march would end up in a battle that would cost the lives of miners, and that her predictions were fulfilled. Art Shields, 0 and the Battle Lines 1919-1939, New York, 1986 p. Were armed with rifles of every description, including many high-powered guns, Army Springfield rifles, and similar weapons, and workers walked about with 2 pistols strapped to their waists. Machine guns were brought and mounted on automobiles, and other miners carried Browning rapid-fire guns which they had used in France during World War I. Red Cross nurses arrived with improvised automobile units, a large red cross marked on their sleeve bands, while on their caps they had sewn UMW, signifying the United Mine Workers of America. Food supplies were commandeered, military passes stamped with the Union seal were issued, and doctors were ordered to accompany the Workers' Army and care for the wounded. However, the marchers never made it to Logan. In the early stage of the battle, the miners were victorious. The ill-assorted army of Baldwin Felt's thugs, state police, and anti-union vigilantes were routed by the miners' army. So complete was the rout that in a rage Sheriff Don Chafin ordered 2 aviators who had been acting as air scouts to carry hastily constructed bombs of large size, made of gas mains loaded with powder and chunks of iron and with glass containers filled with poison gas. Chafin's aviators, as they were called, then bombed 4 Union villages in 3 days and dropped 20 bombs. Of these 8 exploded and tore great holes in the earth but did not hit any dwellings or people. However, it was no fault of the aviators that no one, including women and children, were hit. They flew too high to aim accurately, forced to do so by the high-powered rifles of the miners who were sent back from the march to protect the village's .57. Later, Art Shields, who covered the battle for the Federated Press and the Liberator, visited the villages that had been bombed, and told Mother Jones that he was amazed that such things as airplane bombings of miners' villages could happen in America. Mother Jones looked at me in surprise, he reported. "Don't you know where you are?" she said. "This is the place where they have been murdering men and women since labor first began taking coal out of the ground in West Virginia." 53. While the miners' villages were being bombed by Chafin's aviators, federal troops arrived in the battle area. 6,000 soldiers, assisted by 20 airplanes under the command of Brigadier General Billy Mitchell, were ready to prevent the Union miners from entering the non-Union county. For 2 days, September 2 and 3, 1921, the Battle of Blair Mountain raged as armed Union miners fought the U.S. Army, the Infant Air Force, local deputy sheriffs, and private gunmen. On September 4, the miners surrendered and were disarmed. 3 deputies had been killed, 40 local gunmen were wounded, and one of the 6 Air Service planes had crashed, killing 4 aviators. Union casualties were never revealed. 59. The Industrial Worker, official organ of the IWW, compared the miners of West Virginia to the citizens of Paris who took up arms in 1871 against their oppressors. In the same tradition, the miners of West Virginia took up arms to defend themselves against brigands and murderers. War has been declared by the coal operators and the government of the United States against working men who are American citizens because they will not bow their necks to the authority which would enslave them. 60. The Messenger, the Black Socialist monthly published in New York by A. Philip Randolph and Chandler Owen, declared editorially, "The coal operators seem to be the monarchs of all they survey. Even the president of the nation dares not challenge their ruthless rule. The workers of Mingo are just as much the subjects of the coal kings, as were the mujiks of Russia under the Tsar. They, like the Negro slave, have no rights which their masters are bound to respect. It is, also, interesting to note in this connection that there are both white and black workers in this imperial preserve. Another case where race prejudice goes a-flying before the avenging wrath of the God of private profits. 61. On November 1, 1921, the United Mine Workers' Journal quoted the following from the Baltimore Evening Sun, which described the bitter struggles in Mattawan as having revolved principally around the question as to the right of the miners in the non-union fields to organize. The Sun continued, "But the fight has not been a fair one. Through the power of their money these operators have brazenly bought up the politics of the state. Through their control of successive state administrations they have controlled the law offices and controlled the courts. Paid private detectives and plug uglies employed by them as spies and mine guards, with the aid of deputy sheriffs paid from out of the mine company's treasuries, have ruthlessly brushed aside every constitutional guarantee claimed by the miners as to the right of peaceable assemblage, as to the right of free speech and even as to the right of jury trial, all in an effort to crush every attempt on the part of the miners to organize. These are not empty charges. They have been supported time and again by evidence collected by congressional investigating committees. To say that there can be industrial peace or peace of any kind in West Virginia under such conditions is to assume that the state is ripe for slavery. This being the case, have not the American Pay Zero PLE as a whole the right to demand that the Constitution be definitely re-established in West Virginia? That the system of private enforcement of the law, or what the private companies choose to regard as the law, be abolished, and that an honest effort be made to get at the root of the trouble. How about using the same authority to suppress the references to the notorious Supreme Court decision, Dred Scott v. Sanford, 1857, in which Chief Justice Roger B. Taney declared, in writing the majority opinion, that Negroes had no rights which the white man is bound to respect. See Philip S. Foner. History of Black Americans to Westport. Con, 1983, 221. The lawlessness of the mine owners as well, and to enforce both sides to an agreement? On the 50th anniversary of what he called the biggest armed struggle in U.S. labor history, Art Shields wrote that he would like to correct some misunderstandings about this dramatic chapter in working-class history. The armed march was not an insurrection, although the miners fought state police as well as company gunmen. It was not an attempt to take over the mining industry and to change the social system, although there were many former socialists and a number of communists among the marchers. It was an armed mass movement in defense of Union brothers, who were being butchered and enslaved by the minions of murderous financiers. And it followed extreme provocation. The armed march had nothing in common with acts of anarchist violence by lone individuals or handfuls of individuals. It was a grassroots movement, to use an old phrase. It was a movement of men united by strong class feelings. They came from more than 100 different communities with their own supply organizations. The march demonstrated some of the creative qualities of a militant working class that will in time take power. And it left behind a feeling of pride that persists after 50 years. 62. A special grand jury at Logan immediately began to investigate the miners' march. In charging the jury, Judge Bland declared that if it found that the armed miners had marched into Logan County, in defiance of the law, any person in the march might be indicted for murder in the first degree, for the deaths that had taken place. On September 17, the grand jury brought in indictments against 500 members and officers of the United Mine Workers for murder, insurrection, and carrying arms. The 500 included 3 UMW officials, who were immediately dismissed by President John L. Lewis. William Blizzard, president of Subdistrict 4, District 17, UMW, was acquitted of the charge of treason on May 27, 1922, but the Reverend J. E. Wilbur, the miners' pastor, and his son were convicted of murder in the second degree in trials held during the spring and summer of 1922. In legal battles over the next 2 years, most of the charges against the other defendants were dismissed, or they were either acquitted or paroled. In 1923, Governor Ephraim E. Morgan released those miners who were still imprisoned and who had families. 63 The released men returned to the same conditions which had provoked the bloody uprisings. However, Frank Keeney, the local UMW organizer, told a reporter, "They say we shall not organize West Virginia. They are mistaken. LF Frank Keeney can't do it, someone will take his place who can. But West Virginia will be organized, and it will be organized completely." 64 inches They also fought the U.S. Army and Air Force. And West Virginia was organized. In 1932, the Norris-LaGuardia Act became law. In addition to imposing limits on the judiciary in labor disputes, the law forbade the Yellow Dog contracts, which had served as the foundation for the Hitchman ruling in 1917 and the Red Jacket ruling in 1927 by the Supreme Court, both of which stemmed from West Virginia cases and played a major role in the successful effort of the coal operators to defeat the UMW during the 19,205. In 1933, armed with the National Industrial Recovery Act Section 7(a), the United Mine Workers surged into the coal fields to organize the miners of West Virginia, and within a few years, Keeney's prophecy was fulfilled. Alabama. A bitterly fought strike of the Alabama coal miners was conducted by the UMW during the fall and winter of 1920-21. The strike call was issued on September 4, 1920, and about 12,000 of the 27,000 miners in Alabama responded. The operators attributed so great a response to the fact that about 80% of the miners were Southern Negroes who are easily misled, especially when given a prominent role in both races are members. 65. Although wages, hours, and other grievances were involved, the main issue in the strike was union recognition. But the operators publicly stated that one of the major obstacles to recognition was the UMW's practice of associating the black man on terms of perfect equality with the white man. 66. While this was an exaggeration, the fact is that unlike other AFL organizations, since the late 19th century the UMW had organized black coal miners and had supported them during strikes against the coal operators. Moreover, the UMW appointed black organizers, and for a time, blacks were chosen to serve on the union's highest elected councils. 67. To be sure, the UMW's commitment to racial equality was hardly consistent. The union did little to erase the racial division of labor in coal mining, in which black miners most often got less skilled positions, while the white miners jealously guarded their higher-paid jobs. A slowly progressing mechanization of coal mining in the 20th century widened this racial split. White miners took most of the machine operators' jobs, leaving lower-paid manual tasks to black workers. 68. Nevertheless, there is no question that the UMW was far in advance of most other AFL affiliates on the issue of black-white unity, especially in the South. On September 13, 1920, Judge W.L. Grubb of the Federal District Court issued an injunction against the UMW officials and miners forbidding interference in any manner with the operation of the mines of the Pratt Consolidated Coal Company, including peaceful picketing. Moss E. Kirby moved to break the strike by calling out the National Guard and the Alabama State Law Enforcement Bureau. Strikers were beaten and arrested. In many mining camps, miners and their families were required by company guards to have written passes before they were allowed to leave the camp for any reason. By February 1921, thousands of strikers had been evicted from their company houses and left homeless. The union furnished tents for these strikers and their families. 69. By February the strike had begun to weaken and the miners began to drift back to work. In the hope of preventing defeat, the UMW agreed on February 22 to let the governor decide the outcome of the battle by ruling for or against the strikers' demands. As the union might have expected, Governor Kirby handed down a decision on March 12 that rejected every demand of the strikers. He ruled that it was not necessary for the operators to recognize the union or even to do anything for the betterment of the mine workers of Alabama. Moreover, the governor declared that the operators were under no obligation to re-employ striking miners. 70. The United Mine Workers Journal called the governor's ruling an unholy attempt to run the union out of Alabama, but the union agreed to abide by it. For all practical purposes, the United Mine Workers had been destroyed in Alabama. As one scholar notes, when the UMW called a nationwide strike in 1922, the Alabama mines ran full-time, supplying markets usually filled with coal from the strike zones. But he adds, during the coal strike of 1922, Negroes were imported from the southern states to the western Pennsylvania coal fields, but when informed of the situation, the blacks joined the UMW in large numbers. 72 inches, in 1923. Richard A. Straw points out, UMW strength in Alabama was below 2%. The United Mine Workers of America in the 1920 Coal Strike in Alabama. Alabama Review, April, 1975, page .127. Chapter 12. The miners. 2. The most militant and class-conscious district of the United Mine Workers of America was not situated in the United States. It was District 26, composed of the Cape Breton miners of Nova Scotia, Canada. In the Cape Breton coalfield, the emergence of organized labor began in the 18,605. In 1868, coal miners at Crow Bay, Port Maurienne, attempted to form a union, but the organizers were arrested and forced to disband the organization. 1 Permanent trade unions became established in the years after the formation of the Provincial Workmen's Association at Spring Hill in 1879. The PWA's approach to collective bargaining was not aggressive, and no written agreement was signed until 1905. The PWA's reluctance to press strong wage demands was most clearly reflected in the idea of class harmony which pervaded the association's ritual. Our object is not to wage a war of labor against capital, nor to drive trade by oppressive measures from the locality. On the contrary, by mutual concessions between masters and men, we seek to have it carried on with advantage to both. 2. The growth of large-scale capitalism in Cape Breton after the 1890s led to several confrontations that revealed the weaknesses of the PWA. The most important of these took place in 1904. When the steelworkers' lodges at Sydney struck against wage reductions, they faced troops, militia, strikebreakers, and evictions. The strike ended in complete defeat and a blacklist of union leaders. 3. The defeat encouraged the growth of a reform movement within the PWA. Much attention focused on proposals to increase dues, strengthen the defense fund, and allow a membership vote on union officers. The most far-reaching reform was a proposal discussed as early as 1902, affiliation with the United Mine Workers of America. In May 1908, delegates to the Grand Council authorized a referendum on the choice of putting the PWA in better condition or joining the United Mine Workers of America. The vote was 2,860 in favor of the UMW. At the end of the September Council 230 meeting, the vote was set aside, and in the following months, rebellious lodges began to dissolve and form UMW locals. In January 1909, the locals received a charter as District 26 of the United Mine Workers of America. 4. UMW supporters soon met discrimination in the mines. Lodges were blacklisted and Dominion Coal refused to meet UMW officers. On July 6, 1908, District 26 began a strike for union recognition. But PWA members remained at work under military protection while UMW members faced arrests and evictions from company houses. Although the UMW spent almost $1 million in Nova Scotia in 1909-10, the strikes at Glace Bay, LNVE Mess, and Spring Hill all failed. The failures were disastrous for the miners. The PWA never recaptured its former support among the coal miners, and membership in District 26 dwindled to a few stalwarts. In 1915, the International Union withdrew the district charter. 5, but this was not the last to be heard of the United Mine Workers in Nova Scotia. By the summer of 1916, 2 years into World War I, the effects of rising prices in the industrial district had led to a growing agitation for wage increases among the coal miners. The agitation continued to gain strength, both within the PWA lodges and the locals of a new provincial organization, the United Mine Workers of Nova Scotia (UMWNS). The companies granted several wage increases in 1916, but at the end of the year, they rejected further requests from the PWA and refused to meet officers of the UMWNS. 6. In March 1917, both the PWA and UMWNS applied to the Department of Labor of the federal government for conciliation boards. Following a visit by a federal official, the government on April 19, 1917 appointed a Royal Commission. The Chisholm Commission, named after its chairman, Nova Scotia Supreme Court Justice J. A. Chisholm, recommended a large wage increase, and also succeeded in reconciling the rival unions. Meeting with the officers of each union, the commissioners secured an agreement that the two organizations would amalgamate. 7 On June 12, separate conventions of the PWA and UMWNS met in Sydney and concluded plans for a provisional union to inherit the PWA's agreement with the coal operators. The reunification of the coal miners in one union was the key theme in the speeches at the founding convention of the Amalgamated Mine Workers of Nova Scotia, AMWNS, in October 1917. A toast reflected the spirit of the occasion. Here's to the convention assembled. Let it be remembered. The split has been welded at last. Let us prove to all classes we're not such damned asses as we have been in the past. 8. In March 1918, after a referendum vote 96% in favor, the Amalgamated Mine Workers of Nova Scotia affiliated with the United Mine Workers of America. The AMWNS brought with it into the UMW the preamble to its constitution, which read in part, "Whereas a struggle is going on in all nations of the industrial world between those who labor and those who appropriate the wealth resulting from social labor. This irrepressible struggle over the distribution of the proceeds of labor is ever bringing more and more strength to the working class and imposing upon it ever greater duties and responsibilities, and, believing that all rivalry, whether between individual workmen or organizations, can bring to them only disastrous results. We therefore declare it to be our irrefutable duty to join hands and forces to form all miners and mine laborers in Nova Scotia into a trade union for the purpose of securing to its members the social value of their labor and procuring such legislation as they may require from time to time." The preamble was retained word for word in the new constitution adopted by District 26, UMWA, in April 1920.10. One can measure the radical approach of the Nova Scotia miners to the problems of industrial society by the actions taken in November 1918. The delegates to the AMWNS convention endorsed the principle of public ownership of industry, and asked the government to nationalize all industries and their operation for the benefit of the country instead of for private enrichment. The convention also endorsed a Reconstruction Report, which proposed a list of specific demands and a far-reaching program of social reform. The report called for improved living conditions in the coal towns, the repeal of war measures such as conscription and the orders in council restricting freedom of speech, assembly and the press. A statement for nationalization of coal mines and other essential industries reiterated the earlier resolution for public ownership. The longest section of the report advanced an analysis of which the most relevant section was entitled, "The Unemployed." Here the report predicted the likelihood of grave dislocation of profit-making industry after the war and warned that many thousands of willing workers will, if matters are left with private capitalism, probably be walking the streets in search of employment. Accordingly, the report recommended a 10-year program of public works, housing and social construction in order to prevent unemployment. 11. What accounts for the radical militancy of the Cape Breton miners of Nova Scotia? Despite the advance of machinery and the division of labor, the Cape Breton mines of Nova Scotia remained largely hand-powered. About 4 in 5 of the 10,000 Cape Breton miners were employed underground. More than half the underground miners worked at the coal face, in isolated 20-foot-wide rooms. The miners, usually working in teams of 2, extracted the coal from the seam and loaded it into wooden boxes. In the coal mines of Nova Scotia, mining remained dangerous work. Accidents were a common fact of life among the miners. In 1917, 294 accidents were reported, and in 1918, 362 accidents. In the years 19,201,923, the annual fatalities in the British Empire Steel Corporation (BESCO) mines of Nova Scotia averaged 2.11 per 1,000. In the same period, the rate in Britain was 1.00 per 1,000 employees. The years from the mid-18905 to the MID 19305 revealed no substantial improvement in fatality rate in Nova Scotia. In 29 of the 40 years, the rate exceeded 2.0 deaths per 1,000, and in another 8 years, the rate exceeded 3.0 per 1,000.12. In the decade after 1917, safety was a major concern among the Cape Breton miners. Blood on the coal, increased the demand for public ownership of the mines without compensation for the operators. James Bryson McLaughlin, the leader of the militant miners, argued for this position before the Royal Commission on the Coal Mining Industry in Nova Scotia, the Duncan Commission, saying, "The workers have put too much into these mines. 3 lives in every 1,000. This is more than all the millions they, the operators, have put in. Over the period of years they have put the money in, the workers have put their blood in it." 131. Between the years 1917 to 1926, a total of 64 strikes occurred in the Cape Breton mines. 14 of them were wage disputes, including the 3 major district-wide strikes against wage reductions in 1922, 1924, and 1925.14. Several strikes in the Cape Breton mines had political dimensions. In July 1918, many locals carried out a one-day protest strike when the provincial legislature rejected the 8-hour bill. The Halifax Herald reported the mines were closed by the miners, to show the government they had some power. 15 inches the Russian Revolution and the Winnipeg General Strike, notes David Frank, inspired wide interest and sympathy among the miners of Nova Scotia. On May 1, 1920, in response to an appeal from Winnipeg for demonstrations in support for the arrested leaders of the General Strike, the coal miners of Nova Scotia closed the mines for a one-day general strike. 16. At the 1922 District Convention, May Day was adopted as a formal holiday, and in 1924 the district constitution was amended to include May 1 as an annual holiday. May Day was observed with parades and meetings. 17 ICN notes. For the Winnipeg General Strike, see Philip S. Foner, History of the Labor Movement in the United States 8, 79-87. The most important strike in the category of political acts was the sympathetic strike in which the coal miners shut down all the Cape Breton mines in order to force the withdrawal of troops and police from Sydney, where the steelworkers were engaged in a strike for higher wages and union recognition. As we shall see, when coal miners came to the assistance of the steelworkers in July 1923, the employers, provincial government, John L. Lewis and the entire leadership of the UMW combined to punish them and their union. The majority of strikes during this period were disputes involving workers' control of the organization of work in the coal mines. These disputes involved such issues as the status of the union, the use of machinery, the duration of the working day, and the manager's authority to change work rules and assignments, and to discipline and dismiss employees. In April 1918, 2,000 men at the 4 Northside mines operated by the Scotia Company took a holiday because management evaded meeting mine committees. The strike succeeded in gaining meetings between the Scotia management and the new amalgamated mine workers of Nova Scotia. Subsequently, wages were adjusted by Royal Commission. 18. Later in the year, the Scotia miners again went on strike, this time to establish the union's closed shop at the mines. In this case, 4 employees promoted to the position of mine examiners withdrew from the union. One mine was idle 4 days, while the other 3 mines came out in support for the last 2 days of the strike. As a result, the deputies returned to the union. In several disputes still later, the miners were successful, as before, in forcing non-members to leave the mine or to join the union. 19. The largest number of disputes over the manager's authority involved the dismissal of individual miners. Number 1 Princess Collier was idle Saturday on account of 2 of the employees not receiving their lamps, went a report in the Sydney Post. This action seemed to dissatisfy the remainder of the workmen, who immediately returned home until those men were reinstated. 20 In nearly all cases in which the miners went on strike to protest the dismissal of fellow workers, they won either a compromise or a complete victory in protecting the discharged men. 21. As a result of the frequent strikes in which the coal miners took issue with managerial authority and engaged in collective action to demonstrate their protest, the Montreal Agreement, concluded in the fall of 1920, included several clauses specifying the company's authority over the workplace. A section of the agreement, entitled Management of Mines, stated, "The right to hire and discharge, the management of the mine and the direction of the working forces are vested exclusively in the company, and the United Mine Workers of America shall not abridge this right." 22. But when the District Convention took up the Montreal Agreement, the contract was rejected by a vote of 76 to 20. In the end, however, following extreme pressure by the district officials, a referendum vote approved the contract by a margin of 6,449 votes. 23. However, under pressure from the union membership, more radical union leaders sought to eliminate the provisions of the Montreal Agreement, which vested complete authority to discharge in the company's power. They supported spontaneous protests originating in workplace actions and, in the major strikes of the 1920s, turned to direct action as a tactic through which the union's major goals could be pursued. Upon the expiration of the Montreal Agreement and two subsequent agreements, British Empire Steel Corporation, BESCO, attempted to introduce large wage reductions. The coal miners refused to accept the reductions, and a long, militant strike followed. At meetings in December 1921, union officers sought a renewal of 1921 rates, but the corporation announced plans to cancel the existing rates, a 12.5% reduction, and to reduce wages a further 25% below the 1920 scale. The reduction amounted to a one-third cut in wages, but was commonly known as a 37.5% reduction. Conciliation proved ineffective. 24. In June 1923, a local strike over the discharge of a number of workers at the Florence Colliery soon threatened to become a district strike. When a group of 9 surface workers were discharged, the 750 men at their mine went on strike in protest. The strike spread rapidly to 3 other North Side collieries and the shipping piers of North Sydney, bringing the number of strikers to more than 2,000 men. On the third day of the strike, a meeting of several thousand miners at the Alexandria Rink in Glace Bay called for a general walkout in the northern districts as well. Although the strike began, like most stoppages, in an unauthorized walkout, the district executives supported the action. District Secretary-Treasurer McLaughlin gave 2 principal reasons for supporting the strike. The men dismissed, he said, were old employees of the company. They have never worked in any other place than the coal mines of this company. Some of the men dismissed are maimed, having been injured in the service of the corporation, and they must get a living whether they can make profits for the company or not. 25. Secondly, McLaughlin linked the protection of these jobs to a larger source of dissatisfaction, the reduction of wages in 1922. Once the men are out, we propose to clean out all, he added. We will ask for the return of the 1921 rates and a complete settlement of serious grievances which have been in the slinger for months past. 26. While peaceful, the tie-up also included the withdrawal of the maintenance men from the mines. The company was forced to reinstate the men, and promised to negotiate any future redistribution of the workforce at the Scotia mines without changes in the rates and wages of the men affected. 27. Restriction of output was a traditional tactic among coal miners, and was used to exert pressure upon employers when traditional methods of fighting were proving to be ineffective. This tactic, of course, was not confined to the coal miners and was widely used by the IWW. 28. In the Scottish coal fields, ca. Canny, going slow, took several forms. Limitation of hours and shifts at the mines, and the regulation of coal loaded by a miner in one day. The usual day's work was referred to as the master's dag. In protest the miners loaded the wee dag. 29. McLaughlin was familiar with these practices as a youth in the coal fields of Scotland in the 18,805, and he played an important part in popularizing the tactic in Cape Breton. In November 1921, as the negotiators for renewal of the Montreal Agreement approached a climax, McLaughlin urged the miners to follow the example of the early Scottish unions. It never occurred to them to consult the operators at all in securing many of the things which they wanted. They simply went ahead and legislated for themselves without ever once consulting the operators. 30. In the first 3 months of 1922, restriction of output played an important part in the wage struggle. In February, the miners rejected the findings of a conciliation board by a vote of 8,109 to 1,352. In the absence of support for strike action from the international office of the UMW, by this time John L. Lewis, whose first consideration was to stop anything that threatened the power of the operators, detested District 26's battles to achieve control of the workplace. The coal miners turned to restriction of output as an alternative. 31 A miner who worked at No. 5 colliery in 1922 recalled how the slowdown operated at his mine. All the men agreed in the local union to load 6 boxes of coal, that'd be leaving off 4 boxes. We generally loaded 10. The driver took his time and the man that was working at the face took his time. And the shiftman had his coal on, the man who was putting up the timber, and he seen a light coming, he'd get up and he'd start to move around. But you couldn't do that on the surface, you know, because all the surfacemen could do was handle the coal that was coming. We all endorsed it and put into effect, and it was effective. There were only a couple of mines in the district that were kind of slow in endorsing this slowdown, but before it went into effect too far the whole district endorsed it, and Togi had it going for months. And the company hollered. They were getting hurt. In mid-February a reporter for the Halifax Herald found that the Fabian tactics were a spontaneous growth, arising from the men themselves as their method of expressing dissatisfaction with the wages now in force. Beyond question, it has operated to cut down production in some mines by something like 50%. 3. Following rejection of the proposed contract on March 11, McLaughlin issued a formal circular appealing for general adoption of the policy. War is on, and it is up to the workers in the mines of the British Empire Steel Corporation to carry that war into the country of the enemy. There is only one way to fight this corporation, and that is to cut production to a point where they cannot any longer earn profits. Every contract man who voted against acceptance of the wage agreement last Tuesday should at once cut down his production to a point where he can get about the same wage as the low-paid men in the mine, and at the same time see to it that every day a paid man takes the full 8 hours each day to send his reduced output on the surface. As a result of McLaughlin's appeal, joint meetings of the locals in Class A, Bay and New Waterford districts endorsed the policy, and after a stormy meeting in which the union officers were equally divided, on March 23 the district executive endorsed the strike as District Policy. 34. Minister of Labour James Murdoch charged the miners were un-British, un-Canadian and cowardly to pretend to be working for a wage rate in effect while declaring to the world that only partial and grudging service will be given. 35 McLaughlin twice addressed lengthy open letters to the members of the House of Commons, and the dramatic protest attracted national attention to the crisis in the coalfield. On March 30, the Western Labour MP5, William Irvine and 1.8 Woodsworth, launched an emergency debate in the House of Commons. In a stirring speech, Irvine, the Calgary Labour MP, declared that wages in Nova Scotia coal mines were 71% lower than in Alberta, while the cost of living was 17% higher, that the men had been working for less than a living wage, and were still expected by the company to agree to a reduction of at least 37.5%. He pictured the conditions in the coal fields where parents were not able to send their children to school for lack of clothing, and stated that all attempts at conciliation having failed, and that lacking funds with which to inaugurate a strike, the miners had been compelled to carry on the warfare against the company by striking on the job. 36. In June 1922, in the midst of the strike, the report of District 26's Policy Committee, adopted by delegates to the District Convention, included a brief analysis of the state of the coal industry. Though brief, it was enough to infuriate the operators and the provincial government. The report began by stressing that in North America, there are enough coal mines, and enough mines opened and equipped for production, to produce almost 2 tons of coal where only 1 ton is required. The result of overexpansion in the coal industry was a superabundance of wealth from production in coal, which employers and governments cited as the cause of idle time and wage reductions. Such, then, was the cruel reason that the mineworkers of this province are being asked by employers and governments to accept as sufficient justification for all the misery now endured by the miner and his family. The report condemned this reasoning with the conclusion, such as the petty state existing among coal miners in Nova Scotia as a result of the determination of the captains of industry to run the coal business. The last paragraph of the report attracted the most attention. Here the Policy Committee outlined several steps to link the local conflict to a national and international class struggle. A short declaration stated, That we proclaim openly to all the world that we are out for the complete overthrow of the capitalist system and capitalist state, peaceably if we may, forcibly if we must, and we call on all workers, soldiers and minor law officers in Canada to join us in liberating Labour. 37. On August 15, 1922, the strike on the job was replaced by the 100% strike for the retention of the 1921 wage scale. When the strike began at midnight on August 15, pumpmen, firemen and other maintenance workers joined the walkout. Stablemen removed the pit horses from the mines before quitting work. Crowds of strikers marched to the power plants at Waterford Lake and No. 2 Colliery in Glace Bay and tied up these operations. No greater tragedy has occurred in Canadian history, fairly wept John Moffat in the Canadian Mining Journal, and it is being conducted with a callous recklessness that savors of madness. In the press, rising water levels were reported in the mines, and at No. 2, the largest coal shaft in the world is in danger of complete destruction. McLaughlin, however, minimized the dangers of the 100% tactic. Don't believe what the officials are telling you about a little water and a little gas putting the mines out of working order forever, he told reporters. Let the mines fill up with water and fill up with gas, and then hand the worst one of them over to the UMW, and in 2 weeks we will have it back into better working shape than the Dominion Coal Company ever had it. 38. As soon as the strike began, in response to the request from the operators, the federal government dispatched some 1,200 troops into the coalfield. The armed men occupied Dominion No. 2 Colliery, the largest producing mine and the site of the power station for the Glace Bay area mines. From a District 26 convention of coal locals in Nova Scotia and New Brunswick, came this appeal to the troops. Over the heads of the government, we appeal to all soldiers and minor law officers. When you are ordered to shoot workers, don't do it. When you are asked to arrest workers, don't do it. When you are asked to spy on workers, don't do it. 39. The 100% strike intensified the conflict between John L. Lewis and District 26. The removal of men from the colliery powerhouses, pumps, fans, engines and other equipment exposed the mines to the danger of accumulated gas and water. Under international union policy, UMW maintenance workers were expected to remain at work during strikes provided the employers continued to pay the wages specified in the last union contract. In advocating the opposite tactic in July 1922, McLaughlin warned the miners that they must forget all the ethics that they had been taught about the property of the owners. No worker must be left on the job taking care of the property of the owners while they grinned like hyenas as they starved the workers back to submission. The workers must remember they were pitting their empty purses and the empty stomachs of themselves and their families against the millions of the operators. 40. The 100% strike ended when British Empire Steel Corporation, BESCO, reduced the wage cut from 37.5% to 20%. 1. Relations between the leadership of the United Mine Workers and District 26 continued to deteriorate after the strike ended. The June 1922 policy report of District 26 included a proposal for the district to apply for membership in the Red L&T International of Labor Unions. Before the convention ended, delegates were appointed by McLaughlin to visit District 18 to seek their cooperation in sending a delegate to the next RLLU convention. Present at the Truro convention was Tim Buck, an organizer for the recently formed Workers' Communist Party of Canada. On McLaughlin's invitation, Tim Buck had spoken in union locals before the convention and addressed the delegates on the subject of the Red L&T International, but according to his memoirs, he was astonished when the proposal to join the RLLU was introduced. 42. After the convention, McLaughlin and other radical union leaders joined the Workers' Communist Party as well as the T.U.E.L, and during the following 2 or 3 years both organizations had a strong influence on the union leadership. The 3 principal officers of District 26 in 1923 and those elected in 1924 were Party and T.U.E.L members, and one of them recalled that there were about 250 Party and T.U.E.L members in the Glace Bay District during this period. Sympathy for the Russian Revolution played some part in the party's growth, but as David Frank points out, just as radicals among the coal miners had supported the Socialist Party of Canada before the war, in the 19,205 they also welcomed the opportunity to join a national radical organization. 43. Moreover, District 26 viewed with favor the battle the T.U.E.L in the United States was waging against the ruinous, dictatorial policies of John L. Lewis. In the election of new district officers in August, the coal miners gave strong support to McLaughlin and his comrades. The Radicals won election to all four main offices: President, Vice President, Secretary-Treasurer, and International Board Member. During these months, spokespersons for the Workers' Communist Party and the T.U.E.L toured the mining district repeatedly. The earliest visitor had been Joseph R. Knight, who toured Nova Scotia in April and May 1922, on behalf of a Russian relief fund. In the next year, Trevor Maguire, H. M. Bartholomew, Red, Malcolm Bruce and Moscow, Jack MacDonald, the party chairman, all attracted large audiences. The party's and the T.U.E.L's influence was increased when Tom Bell, a party organizer from Toronto and Winnipeg, was appointed editor of the Maritime Labour Herald. When the May Day Parade took place in Glace Bay in 1923, it was hailed as a great success in the Labour Herald and the Worker. The parade was headed by the Union leaders and Tom Bell carried the biggest red flag in Canada, 20 feet by 12 feet, bearing the slogans, "Workers of the World, Unite," and "Long Live Communism." Despite an icy rain, the parade included between 4,000 and 5,000 marchers. Later 5,000 people attended a meeting in the Alexandria Rink. Glace Bay Mayor Dan Willie Morrison was in the chair and, in addition to the Union leaders, the speakers included the other Labour MPs, Joseph Steele and Foreman Way. Although the day's events had attracted considerable criticism in the commercial press, Foreman Way proclaimed the spirit of the occasion most accurately when he declared, "The only way we can accomplish anything is not by splitting the working class, but by solidifying it on the industrial field and on the political field." 4. Nothing could be more distasteful to John L. Lewis and his henchmen. Indeed, in the fall of 1922, Lewis and the entire L&T Emational office of the UMW had began to show increasing concern over events in District 26. At the October International Board meeting, the board gave Lewis full power to take whatever action he thought feasible to bring District 26 back to yard. Possibly fearing disruptive actions by Lewis, McLaughlin wrote him in January requesting a ruling on the district's right to join the Red International. The International Board issued an extensive report stating that the Red L&T Emational was an outgrowth of the One Big Union, and had the purpose of, first, control, and afterward the destruction of the bona fide trade union movement. District 26 was ordered to withdraw the application or face the loss of its autonomy. On February 1, 1923, the district executive voted to comply with the Order. 45. But this surrender did not harmonize relations with the International Union. Another source of conflict was the agreement ending the 1922 strike in District 26. In May 1923, a committee of 5 International Board members visited the district and attempted without success to renegotiate the contract with the British Empire Steel Corporation (BESCO). In their report they stated that the wage scale in Nova Scotia was the lowest in any of the districts of the coalfields of North America and was the only district where a reduction of wages was forced on the miners. The committee found a splendid feeling of loyalty to the United Mine Workers, but also ample evidence of the machinations of the Red Outfit of Moscow. At the June board meeting, the UMW issued an order requiring new executive elections and warning that all candidates must be in sympathy with the UMW's objectives. When District 26 met in convention in New Glasgow in June, the delegates rejected Lewis' attempt to restrict the eligibility of candidates and noted that new elections were already planned for August 21. The delegates also made plans to take a referendum vote on whether to strike for the 1921 rates. Although Lewis warned that a strike without international sanction was unconstitutional, a strike vote took place on July 3. Two major locals, Spring Hill and Dominion No. 12, refused to vote, and the turnout was low, but the result was 3,175 to 2,574 in favor of strike action. 46. In his references to Nova Scotia as one of the centers of a communist conspiracy to capture the UMW, Lewis was indicating he was prepared to take disciplinary action in District 26 if he felt that this was necessary. For their part, McLaughlin and the district executive appeared to pursue a cautious policy. The district retreated on the issue of the Red International, and in February McLaughlin wrote to Lewis. Remembering Kansas and District No. 18, and how these districts were split into fragments, we are prepared to retreat from almost any position, rather than give anybody the opportunity to smash our solidarity. The onus for splitting this district shall never rest on this executive board. 7. But the events of the following months provided Lewis with an opportunity to intervene in District 26 with disastrous results for the Nova Scotia miners. Since the defeat of the 1904 steel strike, union organizing efforts at the Sydney plant of BESCO had failed. The Amalgamated Association of Iron, Steel and Tin Workers organized lodges at the plant in 1917, and by 1923 they were gaining strength in an intensive organizing campaign. In December 1922, the steelworkers voted 1,562 to 1,021 to reject a company proposal for a plant council. By early February 1923, steelworkers organizer Foner claimed the plant was 75% organized. When a union man was dismissed for disciplinary reasons on February 13, a walkout began. The union closed the plant for 5 days, and the steelworkers believed that the principle of union recognition was established in the settlement. But when a Department of Labor official visited in late March, he found the company continued to oppose union recognition, the checkoff, and the 8-hour day. When he interviewed the steel union officials, he found the officers of the miners' union were also present. In early February, District 26 had joined the steel union in an alliance, something like a local one big union. At the March meeting, McLaughlin and Livingstone both spoke at length and declared that the miners were determined to support the steelworkers, and if necessary that they would come out in sympathy with them. 48. On April 9, 1923, the New York Times reported from Nova Scotia. The thousands of steel workers and mine workers employed by the British Empire Steel Corporation in Nova Scotia, who are demanding increases in wages, a closed shop and the check-off system of collecting dues, are planning to bring Alexander Howard of Kansas and William Z. Foster of Chicago East on speaking tours to perfect the organization of the strikers. Howard is to be brought by the mine workers and Foster by the steel workers. Both are expected to take part in a May Day celebration now being arranged for Sydney, N. S., the center of the coal and steel industry. Despite the fact that most of the steel workers were earning less than 35 cents per hour, the BESCO Board of Directors again rejected the steel union's wage demands on June 21, 1923, and the offer to sign a contract in return for recognition alone. The crisis finally broke on the morning of June 28 when the union began to close the steel plant. Stormy scenes took place at the coke ovens and the plant gates as crowds of pickets attempted to shut down the operations and prevent maintenance men and non-strikers from entering the plant. On June 30 soldiers arrived from Halifax, and on July 1 a force of provincial police also arrived. On the evening of Sunday, July 1, a squad of mounted provincial police charged up Victoria Road from the plant gates and attacked people in the streets, giving the day the name, Bloody Sunday. As news of the violent episode spread to the surrounding mining communities, protest meetings took place in the coal towns on the following nights. At a mass meeting at the Alexandria Rink in Glace Bay on July 2, several thousand miners demanded that troops and police be withdrawn from Sydney within 24 hours. The next night the union leaders reported on their meetings with company and provincial officials. The miners' meeting again proclaimed support for the steelworkers and declared a strike to demand the withdrawal of troops and police. The next morning the tie-up in the Cape Breton coalfield was complete. At this time McLaughlin and Livingstone also issued a circular letter to the union locals in which they described the events of July 1 and sought to spread the sympathetic strike beyond Cape Breton. No miner can remain at work while the government turns Sydney into a jungle. Call a meeting of your local at once, and decide to spread the fight against Armstrong in every mine in Nova Scotia. 49. 2 days later, on July 6, McLaughlin and Livingstone were arrested. The charge: Attorney General W. J. O'Hearn told reporters, was one of unlawfully publishing false tales whereby injury or mischief was likely to be occasioned to a public interest, namely the government and provincial police of Nova Scotia. The removal of the apprehended men to Halifax, a distance of almost 300 miles, effectively eliminated the union leaders from the strike scene for several days. 50. From the beginning, the Nova Scotia miners had to combat John L. Lewis as well as the British Empire Steel Company, the provincial government and the troops and police sent into the strike zone. At the very outset, Lewis promptly sent a telegram opposing the strike action. District 26 leaders placed Lewis' telegram before the rank and file, along with the strike ballot. A majority voted for the strike. Lewis, however, did not accept this decision. 51. When the Nova Scotia miners actually went on strike in sympathy with the steelworkers, Lewis again intervened. Company officials had at once contacted Lewis. Lewis warned Livingstone on July 7 that a sympathetic strike was in violation of the contract, against union policy, and that the withdrawal of maintenance men from the mines was also indefensible. As Livingstone and McLaughlin were by this time in jail in Halifax, District Vice President Alex S. McIntyre replied on behalf of the executive. He argued that the strike had no connection with contract or wage issues, but was a protest against the use of armed force in labor disputes. The strike was a political struggle of Canadian workers against an evil from which we have suffered for years. Our international union must understand that its jurisdiction does not give it authority to prohibit workers in Canada from waging a political struggle against use of armed forces which are being used to smash our labor movement. Lewis was unmoved. On the evening of July 17, he released a long telegram ordering the suspension of the district's autonomy. Lewis removed the executive board, appointed a provisional president and ordered the resumption of work at the mines. The stormy telegram read in part, "I am familiar with the constant intrigue between yourself, your evil genius, McLaughlin, and your revolutionary masters in Moscow. No doubt the present strike in Nova Scotia corresponds to your idea of a revolution against the British government and is in pursuance thereof. You may as well KN0W now as at any time in the future that the United Mine Workers is not a political institution and cannot be used to promote the fallacious whims of any political fanatic who seeks to strike down the established institution of his government. 52. The men Lewis appointed to replace the ousted officials had been defeated by a 5-1 margin the previous district election. This new leadership secured a court injunction depriving the deposed leadership of headquarters and funds. 53. The miners were forced to retreat at a mass meeting held in Glace Bay. July 18, they denounced Lewis for having lined up with provincial and federal governments and the British Empire Steel Corporation. 3 days later, the coal strike ended. Not long after, the steel strike was over. By the middle of August, the last of the troops had left. Not only was the strike lost, but the miners' union in Nova Scotia was seriously weakened by the intervention of the International Union on the side of the operators, the suspension of district autonomy, and the removal of the district's strongest and most militant leaders. Still, as Charles Lipton points out, later, legislation was enacted at Ottawa greatly restricting the use of militia in strikes. This was a major reform, and much of the credit for it belongs to the miners and steel workers of Cape Breton. 54. For the moment, however, Lewis was jubilant. He made much of the fact that the Red International of Labor Unions had sent $5,000 for relief of the Nova Scotia miners. He charged that Bolshevik gold was behind the strike. 55. Evidently District 26 contemplated quitting the United Mine Workers and joining the One Big Union. On August 20, 1924, the records of the Executive Committee, Trade Union Educational League read: 1. Foster asked Lozovsky to cable Nova Scotia urging them not to split from the UMWA. 2. That Alex Howitt be asked to issue a statement to the Nova Scotia miners, urging them not to split from the UMWA. 3. That the T.U.E.L write an article for publication in the Maritime Labour Herald exposing the OBU and urging them not to split from the UMWA. 4. That Foster write a personal letter to McLaughlin urging him to fight against the split. 55. District 26 remained in the United Mine Workers, but Lewis was convinced that he had extracted the district's teeth and, at the same time, removed a thorn from his side. Chapter 13. The Miners. Early in 1922, the United Mine Workers of America began bracing for a fight to maintain the 1921 rates in the mine fields. Union agreements in the bituminous and anthracite industries were scheduled to expire on March 31, 1922. Refusing to make an agreement to continue at work in case no contract was concluded by the end of March, the miners invited the operators in the Central Competitive Field to a joint conference to be held in January. While operators in Indiana and Illinois accepted, those in western Pennsylvania and some of the Ohio operators rejected the invitation, and the proposed meeting was called off. 1. The reason for the refusal of operators in Pennsylvania to attend soon became clear. Following the lead of West Virginia and Alabama, whose bituminous operators had lowered the wage rate and were operating non-union, Thomas Watkins, president of the Pennsylvania Coal and Coke Company and of the Central Pennsylvania Bituminous Operators Association, demanded that District 2 miners break with the national agreement and mine coal on the 1917 wage scale. Everywhere, Central Competitive Field operators pressed the union to accept a lower wage scale and permit the mechanization and reorganization of production without interference. 2. But rank-and-file miners pressured the union not to yield an inch to the operators' demands, and raised the slogan, "No backward step." In January 1922, the anthracite miners adopted demands for a 20% increase in pay and the introduction of the checkoff, under which the companies would deduct and turn over union dues to the UMW Treasury. The wage issue was critical. The average anthracite miner earned from $1,400 to $1,600 annually, about $200 to $400 short of what the UMW estimated to be the minimum required to maintain a family of 4.3. Negotiations on these demands did not begin until March 15. Meanwhile, the bituminous operators in parts of Ohio and Pennsylvania posted notices of wage reductions of 35 to 40% and announced the Abelide 245. T.U.E.L of the checkoff, to take effect at the expiration of the existing contracts. At the same time, Indiana operators adopted a resolution favoring a drastic reduction in wages. 4. Meeting in convention in mid-February 1922, the miners decided to oppose wage reductions and suspend work, beginning April 1, unless a satisfactory agreement with the operators in the Central Competitive Field was reached before that time. Lewis then proposed that the operators and the union meet in joint conference. But many of the bituminous operators refused, expressing a willingness to meet the miners only in district conferences and to draw up district agreements. Efforts by President Harding to bring about a joint conference of operators and miners fell through. 5. On March 15, negotiations began for a new wage scale between the anthracite operators and the miners. The operators, closely connected with leading Philadelphia and New York banking interests, demanded a 21.5% wage reduction and vigorously rejected the checkoff, which they feared would increase the union's power. Moreover, they suggested that the next contract run for 4 years, but that wages be negotiated annually. If wages could not be agreed upon each year, the operators proposed that the issue be automatically settled by arbitration. This guaranteed a union rejection, since the operators knew the UMW would never accept a determination of wages by a third party. 6. In response to the operators' claim that the industry was losing money, the UMW proposed a thorough investigation of anthracite profits by the Federal Trade Commission and the Interstate Commerce Commission. The operators refused to even discuss this. In fact, they would not discuss any issue unless the union accepted the principle of arbitration. Since the miners refused to yield on this issue, negotiations were at a complete impasse. 7. The operators were convinced that the union would not risk a nationwide strike. For one thing, with the industrial depression and the large stocks of coal in storage, the operators felt they could beat the miners, and this would also be recognized by the union. For another, with iron, steel and railroad companies running 25 to 50% below capacity as a result of the post-war depression, industry could stand a shutdown. In fact, everywhere union miners were being told, "No work today." Finally, they believed that the non-union fields were capable of supplying the nation's coal needs for a substantial period in the event of a strike, so that pressure from the government and public for them to settle would be minimal. 8. But the operators underestimated the miners' determination to resist wage reductions and to win their demands. Moreover, Lewis threatened to form an American, triple alliance, of miners, railroad workers, and longshoremen to protect the union's wartime gains. On April 1, 1922, the UMWA called a strike in both union and non-union fields, for it was Essential for success that the strike be spread to the non-union fields. Production in the anthracite and bituminous mines ceased as 600,000 men stopped work in the first simultaneous walkout of anthracite and bituminous workers in the United States. Not only did union and non-union miners stop working nationwide, but in Utah, the miners forced the union to let them join the walkout. After the Utah coal operators announced a 30% wage cut, the miners, many of them Greek Americans, were ready to strike. The UMW leadership was actually engaged in organizing the miners for the first time after the failure of a strike in 1903-04, but felt that the union strength in the state was too weak to include Utah in the national strike call. But the Utah miners, responding to the wage cuts and promises of better protection against the coal company abuses through a strong union organization, rejected the UMW leadership's position and went on strike without the official sanction of the union headquarters. 9. Since anthracite and bituminous coal mining were two distinct and separate industries, each strike would have to be settled separately. In the bituminous industry, the operators were seeking not only wage reductions, but were trying to destroy the union by replacing national bargaining with local contracts. In the anthracite fields, wages, the checkoff and compulsory arbitration were the basic issues. In Pennsylvania's non-union fields, where the miners had also joined the strike, the operators, led by the steel industry and its captive mines, were determined not to recognize the union. 10. During the strike, dissension in the union almost entirely ceased and opposition to the Lewis leadership was put on hold, except in the Illinois district where Frank Farrington conducted a war of words with Lewis and threatened to undermine the strike by signing an independent agreement with the Illinois operators. By contrast, Alexander Howard urged all-out unity to win the strike. The coal corporations of America are today organized in all parts of the country and are making another fight to crush the life out of the miners' union. Knowing this, as we do, let us all put our shoulder to the wheel and stand firm in the fight for justice for the coal miners of this country, who have fought and suffered and struggled for years, trying to improve and better their conditions. Let there be no backward step. Let the labor movement of America assert itself. Let us serve notice on the coal barons once and for all, that the miners are going to fight on for a brighter and better day, and that we are not going back to the days of old. 11. Throughout April, May and June, the strikers in the union and non-union fields held fast in the face of injunctions, company guards, and state militias. In Utah, the situation was fairly chaotic. After the strikers had armed themselves to resist company guards escorting scabs into the mines, several violent struggles broke out in which one scab was killed and several strikebreakers and strikers wounded. Utah's governor proclaimed martial law and sent in the National Guard. The guardsmen began a roundup of strikers on the morning of June 15. Some 300 miners were herded to a vacant lot, where Major Elmer Johnson ordered the strikers to turn in their weapons. The National Guard also posted sentries on all roads leading to and from the mines and placed machine guns on the hills above the strikers' tent colonies, set up by the union after the strikers' families were evicted from the company houses. 12. The initial policy of the National Guard in Utah toward the strikebreakers was favorable to the strikers. Major Johnson declared that coal operators would not be permitted to ship strikebreakers into the struck mines. Strikebreakers en route to the mines at 3 towns were turned back by the guardsmen. At one of the mines, 5 Japanese strikebreakers were uncovered by an officer of the guard who could speak Japanese. 13. United Mine Workers officials praised the National Guard for its neutral position. In a letter published in the Wyoming Labor Journal, John Ramsey, a UMW leader in Utah, noted, "Judging from the wail of the local press, Carbon County, Utah, operators are not so sure of their position as they were when they finally induced Governor Mabee to order state troops into this field. The advent of the militia meant to them, as it has in most previous strikes, that they could freely import strikebreakers under any form of misrepresentation and be protected in so doing by the militia. But to their bitter chagrin, they are now discovering that the National Guard of Utah is not a strike-breaking agency. It protects men who are voluntarily seeking employment at the coal camps, if necessary, but will not permit men to be shipped in under false representations as to conditions as the practice has been since the strike started. Operators are therefore raising a howl, and are as anxious to get the troops recalled as they were primarily to have them in field. But without avail so far, and a condition we hope will continue. 14. Precisely as Ramsey's letter appeared in the Wyoming Labor Journal, the National Guard ceased preventing the entry of strikebreakers into the previously closed areas and adopted a position much more in harmony with the wishes of the coal operators. 15. The headlines of a Salt Lake Telegram article of July 6, 1922, declared, "National Guard is not preventing men from replacing strikers." The article reported that, because of a potential coal shortage that would bring great hardship to the public, the National Guard would no longer prevent men from entering the coalfields to work. Adjutant General W. G. Williams confirmed the report, declaring that strikebreakers would now be allowed in the mines. 16. On top of this, guard officers, using their power under martial law, denied union officials the right to address gatherings of miners who were at work in the coal camps in order to persuade them to join the strikers. UMW attorney Samuel King attempted to persuade Governor Mabee to stop the anti-strike activities of the Guard, but got nowhere, following which King pointed out how unjustified was John Ramsey's early optimism. The original policy of the National Guard was just and fair, but it only prevailed for a few days, after which the Guard became, as the operators desired it should become, a weapon in their hands to destroy the morale of the striking miners. That it be used to protect strikebreakers and to safeguard the operators in the enforcement of their policies designed to destroy organized labor. 17. In Kansas, Oklahoma, and Washington especially, the strikers were met by anti-labor laws and pro-company governors. In Somerset County, Pennsylvania, a strong open-shop region where the mines were controlled by companies tied to the Mellon National Bank, the Girard Trust Company, the Guarantee Trust, and the Reading, L&T.E.R. Borough and Erie Railroads, and in the case of the Consolidation mines controlled by the Rockefeller interests, coal and iron police terrorized the strikers. Union organizers, sent in by District 2 over the opposition of John L. Lewis, who did not favor extending the strike to non-union fields, were run down by mounted police. Women and children were arrested for parading in support of the strike. The coal and iron police also used fraudulent searches for illegal moonshine to ransack the homes of striking miners. With the help of the ACLU, District 2 pressed the local courts to enforce freedom of speech and assembly in company towns. A major legal victory occurred when a Somerset judge ruled that union meetings were not in violation of an injunction that prevented interference with non-union miners going to work. 18. During all this, the strikers held on doggedly. Foreign bomb miners in many parts of the country proved to be the backbone and heart of the strike. Operators used this fact to appeal to nativist sentiment, charging that the strikers were imbued with foreign principles of radicalism and anarchy, the Rockefeller-dominated consolidation. Mining company cried that the relations with our labor were pleasant. The miners have been working regularly, there was never any trouble of any kind, until local Italian miners, members of the terrorist Black Hand, began terrorizing non-union miners. 19. The strikers paid no heed to red baiting or foreign baiting. It was not unusual, writes Alan J. Singer of the strike in Somerset County, for meetings to bring together Slavic, Italian, Hungarian, Negro, and white American miners. 20. The strikers paralyzed production in both the bituminous and anthracite fields, and kept it to a mere trickle in the hitherto non-union fields of Pennsylvania, such as Somerset County, to take care of the increasing number of strikers evicted from company houses, and to provide food and clothing. Cooperative stores and strike relief centers were set up. Years later, the daughter of a strike leader described one such strike center. A trainload of tents came into our town. They were put on a local coal miner's truck and he took them up and tossed them off in our yard. Then men and women would come and they'd get in line and the clothes would be doled out to them. The salt pork and salt side came in wooden barrels. The mob, sick, would line up at our house and my dad would whack off a chunk for this family, and a smaller chunk for the smaller family. 21. On June 2, in the midst of the strike, the United States Supreme Court handed down its long-awaited decision in the Coronado, Arkansas, coal miners' case. The Coronado Coal Company had sued the United Mine workers for damages resulting from an open shop fight the company forced upon its employees. The lower court convicted the miners' union, and awarded the company damages of $200,000 which, under the treble penalty provided by the Sherman Antitrust Act, meant $600,000. It took 8 years, but the Supreme Court finally upheld the lower court. The leading point in the unanimous decision, written by Chief Justice William Howard Taft, was that labor unions may be sued under the Sherman Antitrust Act for damages to business arising from a strike, and that the strike funds of the unions may be attached as security. The UMW leadership maintained that there was one favorable aspect in the decision, for the National Union of Miners was not shown to have been responsible for the alleged damages, the district organization alone being liable. Judge Taft's decision released $1 million of the UMW's funds which were being held by the courts. This money became available for strike benefits in the 1922 struggle. Hence the union's lawyers pronounced the decision a great victory. Many in the labor movement disagreed. Advance voiced a widespread view when it editorialized. It would have been a great victory if the decision had not carried with it the ruling of the highest court, from which there is no appeal, that unions and individual members and officers may be sued under the Antitrust Act for strike damages. Now all unions are exposed to the greatest danger that ever confronted American labor. Carried to its logical conclusion, the most powerful organizations may be paralyzed by tying up their funds in protracted antitrust litigation. It took 8 years before a final decision was reached in the Coronado case. Gompers denounced the Coronado decision as a blow at the very foundation of the organized labor movement of America. Such a decision, if it holds, means that the big employer and the big financier can impose any condition on the working people and they dare not resist. Senator Robert M. LaFollette, progressive Republican from Wisconsin, agreed. While the Coronado Coal Company decision sets aside the money judgment rendered against the defendants, it is mostly ominous in what it foreshadows for the future of labor in this country. Advance. June 16, 1922. It should also be noted that while unions are made liable for damages to property caused by strikes called by them, employers are not made liable for injury caused to property or human life by forcing a strike or lockout upon their employers. Large numbers of miners have been thrown out of their homes and otherwise subjected to great hardship and misery by the open shop campaign of their employers. There is no legal redress for them. If the employers should charge them with damage to property in connection with the industrial struggle, those unfortunate workers and their organization would immediately be haled to court under the latest decision. The United Mine Workers won a victory, which is already endangering its present fight with the mine owners. The last reference was to the fact that suits aggregating $1 million were being filed against the county officials and against the United Mine Workers of America for the alleged damage done in the strike. The suits against the union were to be brought on the supposed precedent established by the Coronado Coal Company Decision. 23. Fortunately, the strikers received a boost when the railroad shopmen went on strike on July 1, ending the shipment of non-union Southern coal. Before the shopmen's strike, soft coal production was 5,226,000 tons, but in the first week of the strike, it was down to 3,678,000 tons. 24. As coal stocks diminished and non-union production failed to satisfy the demand, a major fuel crisis faced the nation. But the Harding administration, believing that the miners would soon grow weary of the struggle in both the bituminous and anthracite fields, adopted a hands-off policy. As the operators refused to budge, talk began to be heard on the need for public ownership of the mines. Senator William E. Borah of Idaho said he might favor the experiment of public ownership. New York Socialist Congressman Meyer London asked the government to declare the mines to be vested with a public interest and to place them under its control. On June 21, an event occurred which produced federal action. Just outside the militant Union stronghold of Herrin, Illinois, in Bloody, Williamson County, an operator attempted to run a mine with imported strikebreakers protected by heavily armed guards. A large force of armed Union men and local sympathizers surrounded the mine, placed the strikebreakers and guards under siege and demanded their surrender. The armed guards opened fire. After one miner was killed, some accounts indicate 2 were killed. A savage retaliation occurred as about 20 strikebreakers and mine guards, who had surrendered, were slain. On June 29, 1922, John H. Walker, Illinois UMW leader, wrote to Mother Jones, "Very sorry for what happened in Herrin. 2 of our men, defenseless and unarmed, were killed. That provoked the rest to do what they did. 25. We, the jury, find that the deaths of the deceased were due to the acts direct and indirect of the officials of the Southern Illinois Coal Company." Such, after a 5-hour inquest, was the speedy verdict of the coroner's jury appointed to investigate the deaths of 2 Union miners and 19 non-Union strikebreakers in the bloody clash at Herrin. C. K. McDowell, superintendent of the mine, who was himself killed in the fighting, was named as the murderer of one of the Union men. One of the strikebreakers, though wounded himself, swore that he saw McDowell fire the fatal shot. Despite the jury's finding, over 200 Union miners were arrested, but all were acquitted. 26. Herrin was not the only scene of a bloody battle between Union miners, strikebreakers and mine guards during the 1922 struggle. On July 17, 7 Union miners, 12 company thugs and the sheriff of Brooke County were killed in a battle at Cliftonville, West Virginia. When news reached the UMW local in Avella, Pennsylvania, a few miles away, that the Richland Coal Company in Cliftonville had evicted its old employees and imported strikebreakers, the union immediately furnished the evicted families with tent homes. Then when the Union miners in Avella learned that company gunmen and strikebreakers were firing on the tent colony and otherwise harassing the men and women there, a march was begun on the night of July 16 by 800 black and white Union miners. They covered the 10 miles to Cliftonville before dawn, and when the strikebreakers appeared, they appealed to them to stay out of the mines. Shots rang out and one of the Union pickets fell dead. The battle began, and before it was over, 7 Union miners, Sheriff H. Duval, and 12 company guards lay dead. In the next few days, hundreds of miners were arrested. 43 miners were tried and sentenced to prison for terms that ranged from 3 to 10 years on the charge of conspiracy to commit murder. Today, a memorial exists in Avella in honor of the Union miners slain during the 1922 strike. 27 inches A product of the fighting at Heron, observed the labor press, is that the government has decided to make some move in an attempt to hasten a settlement of the coal strike. 28 On July 1st, the same day the walkout became a formal strike by approval of 99.5% of the voting membership. Representatives of the miners and operators met with President Harding at the White House. Since Lewis refused to discuss separate district agreements, nothing was achieved. On July 9, President Harding issued a plan for settlement, largely the brainchild of Secretary of Commerce Herbert Hoover, which proposed that the miners return to work immediately under the old contract, the March 31st wage scale level to be effective until August 10, 1922, while the dispute was decided by a federal arbitration commission consisting of 3 men appointed by the union, 3 by the operators, and 5 by the government. The plan also included the creation of a federal coal commission to investigate every aspect of the coal industry, and to determine a temporary wage scale to be effective until March 1, 1923.29. A majority of the bituminous operators agreed to the president's proposal, but the union officially rejected it on July 15. The miners wanted very much to have the industry investigated, the union pointed out, but it refused to arbitrate the 3 basic rights of complete union recognition: the checkoff, the 8-hour day, and the living wage. President Harding then showed where he stood. He invited the operators to resume operations, sent telegrams to the governors of 20 coal-producing states, asking them to protect the efforts of the operators to work their mines, and instructed the War Department to keep its forces ready for strike duty. 3 degrees. On August 1, Lewis sent the bituminous coal operators of the Central Competitive Field another invitation to confer. On August 7, Lewis signed with operators responsible for the production of 60% of the nation's bituminous coal. Other operators soon followed, and on August 16, Lewis ordered all union men back to work. The United Mine Workers under the agreement were successful in preventing the proposed wage reduction that had precipitated the strike. The union and the coal companies agreed to accept the 1920 wage scale until April 1923. With the gradual resumption of mining in many districts, those operators who had at first refused to participate in the conference signed the agreements that were reached as a result of it, extending the old contract until April 1, 1923. By September 1, most of the union's soft coal fields were in full operation. 31. There were variations in the agreement in various districts. In Utah, the operators announced the rescinding of the wage cut that had precipitated the strike, and agreed that wages would approximate the average wage scale in effect in eastern and western fields. In short, restoring the wage scale in effect before the 30% reduction in April. But in addition, the operators promised to reward the loyalty of those men who had worked during the 5-month strike with a bonus. 32. The anthracite strike continued until September 3. 8 days later, both sides signed an agreement extending the old contract, an agreement proposed by Senator George Wharton Pepper of Pennsylvania. 33. On September 22, the Borah-Winslow Act created a United States Coal Commission to investigate the entire coal mining industry and issue separate reports on bituminous and anthracite mining. Not a single representative or sympathizer of the UMW sat on the commission, while several of the 7 members were noted for their anti-unionism. The commission, 2.5 years later, 65 miners sued the Independent Coal and Coke Company of Utah for wages promised them as a bonus for their loyalty during the 1922 strike. Their disillusionment led to a short strike in 1925. Wyoming Labor Journal, March 27, 1925. Did expose the terrible conditions under which the miners worked and lived, but it refused to recommend any form of nationalization and endorsed the principle of non-union mines as a restraint on the power of the UMW. It did recommend limited government regulation, which would have required the operators to submit annual financial reports as well as the federal licensing of interstate coal shippers. Congress, however, ignored the recommendation. 34. Lewis and his allies hailed the settlement of the strikes, which had lasted more than 160 days, as a tremendous victory, especially in view of the extensive wage cuts that almost every sector of American labor was experiencing at that time. Gompers congratulated the UMW president on his union's achievements. The lesson that is found in the miners' strike. Gompers wrote, is that unity, solidarity and a righteous cause are invincible. 35 There was indeed tremendous unity and solidarity displayed by the miners, but in the settlement Lewis agreed to, the fundamental issues of wages and the checkoff were no closer to solution in September than they had been in March. The failure to achieve some form of union recognition was a serious blow to younger unions in the strike. One student of the strike points out that this left the UMWA in Utah in a nearly lifeless state until 1,933,336 inches. Lewis, moreover, completely abandoned the principle of unity and solidarity with respect to the non-union mines. Many of the operators who signed the agreements with the union ran non-union as well as union mines. A proposal by John Brophy, president of District 2, demanding that the strikers should not return to work until their employers had signed for all their properties, including those that had previously been non-union, was rejected by Lewis. Lewis even promised mine owners that he would not demand agreements covering their non-union properties. When union members in District 2, acting on their own, refused to return to the pits until their employers also signed for non-union miners, Lewis ordered them back. Brophy tried to persuade Lewis to support the miners of District 2 and include them in the final agreement, but failed. Finally, faced with an ultimatum from Lewis to back down or face expulsion from the UMW, Brophy yielded, and, bitterly, ordered the men in the union mines back to work. Degree 7 *. The United Mine Workers did not, however, abandon the Utah fields as they had following the 1903-04 strike. Instead, they remained to provide legal and monetary support for 16 strikers who had been arrested during the strike. The efforts to secure justice for the 16 men took nearly 4 years, and cost the union a great deal of money. But they produced results. Most of the accused men were acquitted. Others were found guilty of voluntary manslaughter, but were given the sentence of 1 year. On March 20, 1926, paroles were granted to those in prison. Allen Kent Powell, Utah and the Coal Miners' Strike of 1922. Utah Historical Quarterly 45, Spring, 1977, 148-49. Lewis' conduct in the strike consisted of militancy in words and class collaboration in deeds. He continued to maintain publicly that the miners would take no backward step, and he raised the threat of nationalization of the coal mines if the operators did not yield. But he backed away from proposals for nationalization in the American Triple Alliance he had promised to create in the event of a strike. And whenever the miners took militant action to enforce these principles, and especially when they tried to use the strike to organize the non-union mines, he threatened them with expulsion from the union. 38 Small wonder that a tribute to Lewis appeared in the Financial World of New York. Capital can doff its hat to him in admiration and deep in its heart wish there were more like him. Lewis is capable of understanding there must be an amicable partnership between capital and labor. 39. Lewis' role in the 1922 strike brought the growing opposition to his leadership to a head. Following the strike, the miners went back to the pits at wages based upon a modified 1919 agreement. But for the first time since 1898, the union negotiations had failed to get all the operators in the Central Competitive Field to agree to the same contract. The operators gleefully informed the press that the CCF had been repudiated. Thomas W. Atkins, president of the Pennsylvania Coal and Coke Company, declared, "The Central Competitive Field, to which we attribute most of our past difficulties, was definitely given up and abandoned. 0 major companies like us Steel were now able to operate union mines in Illinois and Indiana, while operating non-union at Frick Coal in Pennsylvania. Consolidation Coal, the Rockefeller Company, signed union agreements for its northern West Virginia mines, but continued to operate non-union in Maryland and central Pennsylvania. Peabody Coal ran union in Illinois and non-union in Pennsylvania. 1. Still, Lewis insisted that the miners have won their fight. There is no longer any thought in any quarter that wage reductions will be imposed in the mining industry. The question here is one of procedure without undue humiliation of the operators. We have no desire to humiliate them. 2. But the operators had no hesitation to humiliate the miners. The restored pay scale following the rescinding of the wage cuts which precipitated the strike was short-lived, and miners were forced to fight pay reductions year after year. They also had to fight death, as distressingly high mortality rates. Many fields, however, were racked by wildcats as union miners refused to return to work, while thousands of miners in the outlying districts who had joined the strike to win a national contract and union recognition remained closed out of the agreement. Not until August 14, 1923, did District 2 end the strike in Somerset County. Alan J. Singer, which side are you 0N? Ideological Conflict in the United Mine Workers of America, 1919 to 1928. Ph.D. dissertation, Rutgers University, 1982, pp. 127, 166. Continued to plague the industry. As the American Association for Labor legislation noted for 1922, the fatality rate in our coal mines is 3 times as high as that of Great Britain and has been so for many years. No up-to-date comparison with other countries is available, but in 1910 our coal mine fatality rate was 4 times that of either Austria or Belgium. Yet according to expert testimony, many natural conditions in this country, including rock formations and depth of mines, are considerably more conducive to safe mining. Ignorance, carelessness and indifference are responsible for our high accident rate. The association cited official figures showing that for the past years an average of 2,396 men had been killed annually in U.S. coal mines, and that during the first quarter of 1922 alone 566 coal miners had been killed. An estimate based upon data in Utah indicated that there were more than 150,000 non-fatal coal mine injuries annually in the country, and that in addition to killing about 3 miners in every 1,000 American miners, 1 miner in every 5 was injured more or less seriously. The association blamed insufficiently stringent laws, inadequately trained inspectors, ignorant foremen and fire bosses, indifferent employers, uninstructed and careless miners, and lack of sufficient concern in top union circles. 43. During the strike 2 groups emerged to defend the miners' freedom and lead the rank and file miners against the despotic, class collaborationist policies of the Lewis administration. One group was located in District 2, Central Pennsylvania, and centered around its district president, John Brophy. The other was centered around William Z. Foster, and many of its leaders were affiliated with the T.U.E.L and the Workers' Communist Party. UMWA District 2 included 14 counties centered around the central Pennsylvania counties of Cambria, Clearfield, Indiana, Jefferson and Blair. John Brophy, its leader, was elected president in 1916 as a dissident candidate who challenged nepotism and the refusal of district officers to battle the operators for refusing to pay for pushing cars to the surface in the narrow-seamed mines. Soon after he was elected president, Brophy endorsed a UMW organizing drive in the non-union coal fields and supported rank-and-file Democratic participation in the union. He warmly endorsed the political program of the 1919 UMW Cleveland Convention, which called for nationalization of the mines, the organization of the unorganized and the formation of a labor party, as the Miners Program. Brophy publicized the Miners Program through a series of pamphlets and labor education workshops across the district. In addition, women's auxiliaries were organized to involve wives in understanding the issues and to organize strike support and picketing. District 2 in the Pennsylvania Federation of Labor jointly sponsored a workers' education bureau and held a series of labor chautauquas where speakers addressed different aspects of the Miners Program. The district also published its own paper, the Penn Central News, to spread its ideas. Asterisk. District 2 put it succinctly. If the rank and file know the facts and how to act as a unit in changing conditions, they can obtain every just and reasonable demand. The weakness of labor is not because of the strength of the opposition on the part of the owners. The weakness of labor is in our own indifference to conditions under private ownership and autocratic management. When we as miners know what we want with a lively conviction, we shall win. As chairman of the UMW's Nationalization Research Committee, Brophy used his position to advance the program for the nationalization of the mines, and to present the case for nationalization effectively. Although Lewis and his henchmen denied the NRC access to the UMW Journal to present its findings to the membership, the committee published its reports independently through District 2 and sympathetic journals. How to Run Coal and the Government of Coal were outstanding examples of NRC publications. The pamphlets spelled out Brophy's argument that coal had to be treated as a public utility, and the coal industry was compared to the post office as a public necessity, which should be owned and operated for the benefit of the people and not for private profit. How to Run Coal also pointed out that since the coal industry was so dependent on transportation, the miners' program is one with the program of the railroad workers for nationalization of the railroads. 45. Nationalization, according to Brophy, was also the basis for achieving total unionization and the creation of a labor party. In a speech to the 1922 District 2 Convention, Brophy emphasized, "If labor and other forward-looking groups want to accomplish anything substantial in the way of enacting progressive laws, it must provide either sufficient opposition to compel the dominant party to action or vote them out and fill their places with labor's own representatives." 46. The demand for nationalization of the coal mines was an issue close to the hearts of many miners. The UMW had frequently gone on record favoring such nationalization, and Lewis himself had spoken in favor of it on more than one occasion. However, as was typical of him, his words were rendered meaningless by his actions, and he even had the United Mine Workers' Journal, the union's official organ, condemned nationalization as a communist plot. 47. In 1920, Brophy's committee submitted a report stating that the coal industry was so disorganized and mismanaged that the situation AP, in calling for such a paper, District 2 made the point that there is no modern, progressive labor paper going into the home of each miner. Such a paper would discuss nationalization and workers' control in each issue. Socialist Review, April-May, 1921, page .44. Approached catastrophe. It was clear, the report went on, that the game is up. The old game of speculative profits, overproduction, shortages, sky-high prices, unemployment, gunmen, spies, the murder of miners and a sullen, desperate public. The operators had a fresh explanation every year for this annual crisis. One year it is a car shortage, another year high wages, then the war, then government interference. Of thought-out plan and remedy they have offered none. The committee continued. The only large-scale proposal has come from the UMW in their demand for nationalization. It is the only proposal that grapples with slack work for the miners, high prices and irregular supply for the consumer. 48. Lewis rejected the report and proposed instead that the problem of unemployment be dealt with by closing down several thousand mines and eliminating about 200,000 miners. In a letter to the United States Coal Commission, he urged the operators to close down 4,000 of the unnecessary coal mines, noting, the United Mine Workers cannot close down these mines, because it has no such right, power or authority. Nor can it, for the same reason, put 200,000 miners out of the industry. But the operators can do it if they will. We challenge them to make the start. L. 9. The Trade Union Educational League as well as District 2 condemned Lewis' proposal, calling it reeking with toadyism towards the capitalists and contempt for the workers. 50 at the same time that District 2 was advancing its miners program against the opposition of John L. Lewis, the T.U.E.L was seeking to unify the rank-and-file opposition to the Lewis machine and establish a democratic, militant, miners' union. While the T.U.E.L was handicapped because it lacked a district base of support similar to that of Brophy's in District 2, it had the advantage of William Z. Foster's long experience in combating bureaucratic officialdom and the support of capable, militant rank-and-file leaders among the miners. 51. The T.U.E.L had supported the 1922 strike and had praised the solidarity and militancy of the miners. The League had appealed to the railroad workers to support the miners, raising the slogan, Hull number scab coal. 52. But the T.U.E.L condemned Lewis for concluding the agreement ending the strike without any consideration for non-union men who had suffered so much during the struggle in solidarity with the union strikers, and who were now left entirely at the mercy of the operators. The T.U.E.L also criticized Lewis for his attitude toward the railroad shopmen, who had remained on strike after the miners had returned to the pits, holding out in the face of the worst anti-labor injunction in American history. Lewis not only rejected any efforts to call sympathy strikes by the miners in support of the shopmen, but when he learned that there was a demand emerging for the AFL Executive Council to consider a general strike, he voiced the opinion that any serious contemplation of such policy is in error. 53. Shortly after the 1922 strike, William Z. Foster, on behalf of the T.U.E.L, called a meeting of rank-and-file miners opposed to John L. Lewis policies. They gathered in Pittsburgh on February 10, 1923, at what was called the Progressive International Conference of the United Mine Workers of America. The conference adopted an 8-point program calling for 1. Nationalization of the coal mines, 2. Organization of the unorganized miners and the inclusion of non-union miners in settlements, 3. Election of union organizers by the rank and file, instead of their appointment by the international officers, 4. Remodeling of the Union Constitution to bar fraudulent elections, 5. A 6-hour workday and a 5-day week, 6. Endorsement of amalgamation, 7. A fighting alliance between the miners and railroad labor, and 8. The establishment of a national agreement for all miners. A special demand was advanced calling for the reinstatement of Alexander Howitt and August Dortche. The conference announced the formation of the Progressive Miners International Committee and warned the reactionary officialdom which is thus trying to strangle the United Mine Workers of America will not find such easy sailing today, as they have heretofore. The Progressive Miners International Committee is organizing the forces of the militant rank and file in every district and subdistrict of the Union. With organization, the progressives are finding power, and before long the bankrupt leaders will find themselves discarded by the membership, before which they are already discredited. Kept aware by spies of everything that occurred in Pittsburgh, John L. Lewis immediately charged that the conference was solely the work of William Z. Foster on behalf of the Workers' Communist Party. In truth, while Foster played an active role in organizing the conference, the meeting was also the result of work by militant local leaders of the UMW. They combined the experience of many years of struggles in the Union. Alan J. Singer points out a concept of organizational discipline learned from the communist labor movement, and an intimacy with rank-and-file militancy in the UMWA. They included Thomas Myerscough, leader of the Charleroi Group in western Pennsylvania, who was a member of the Workers' Communist Party, Anthony Meinerich of North Bessember, local. As Alan J. Singer points out, one of Lewis' most effective devices against rank-and-file insurgency was a spy network of organizers on the international payroll. The organizers kept track of potentially dangerous rank-and-file militants, to report on dissident meetings, to spread dissension in districts and locals hostile to Lewis, to locate loyal miners willing to oppose insurgents in their locals, and to collect potentially damaging information that could be stored for future uses. When the network proved inadequate, private security police and informers were hired to supplement the data. Singer, Op. Cit. p. 119. All the material and data collected were filed at the UMWA headquarters, which housed a huge anti-communist file. 4238 and Patrick T.U.E.L of Local 1724. Other men who helped organize the conference and played significant roles in it were Alexander Howitt and August Dortche of District 14, Kansas, Dan Singer, president of Local 4701 in District 12, Mauza, Illinois, and a number of representatives from District 2, including Powers Hapgood. 55. Together with Foster, these militants formed the organizing committee at Pittsburgh to call the Second Conference in June 1923. The call for the Second Conference rejected dual unionism and insisted that the opposition forces were determined to fight for change within the UMW. 56. On June 2, 1923, the militants met again in Pittsburgh. This time, 200 delegates from 12 UMW districts, including several from Canada, and 2 from District 2, one of whom was Powers Hapgood, attended. They consisted of communist and non-communist militants. In sharp contrast to most UMW conventions, where international officers and staff dominated proceedings throughout, the Pittsburgh Conference was run in an open and democratic manner. 11 nominations were made directly from the floor, and delegates from District 2 and other non-communist miners were selected for responsible positions. A rule was established that no speaker could address an issue a second time until everyone who desired had a chance to speak. 57. In his speech opening the 1923 conference, Foster pointed out that the United Mine Workers offered a splendid opportunity for militant activity. To a greater extent than in any other union, he declared, the revolutionary elements had remained within the ranks of the organization, shunning dual unionism and helping to infuse it with a progressive if not revolutionary spirit that was greater than in almost any other union. Unfortunately, he went on, up to that point, the struggle for progress in the UMWA has been a desultory and unsystematic guerrilla warfare, mostly upon a local or district basis and usually upon minor issues. What was needed was first, to unite all the progressive forces in the various districts into one uniform movement, and secondly, to lay plans for the setting up of an organization capable of putting that program into effect. Foster was followed by Alexander Howitt, who endorsed his analysis and declared that he himself was being victimized because he refused to become a cog in the corrupt administration and to do Lewis bidding. He considered the progressive movement being launched in Pittsburgh as Powers Hapgood was a graduate of Harvard University who joined the United Mine Workers while researching a book in Bear Creek, Montana. At a March 2, 1921 meeting with John Brophy, he decided to become a union organizer. He wrote to his mother, "The more I see of these fellows in the labor movement the better I like them and the more I feel that I will stay in the labor movement and work for a better society from the inside." In April 1922, Brophy appointed Hapgood an organizer in the Somerset field. Singer, Op. Cit. p. 181. McAllister Coleman, Men in Coal, New York, 1943, page 111. Historic importance and that it would result eventually in cleaning out the crooks and reactionaries not only of the miners' union but also of the whole American labor movement. August Dorchy, the expelled vice president of the Kansas district, also addressed the gathering. He told the delegates that in his experience, it was hard to tell the difference between the union officials and the mine operators either in their makeup or point of view. In fact, often the employers show more sympathy for the miners' cause than do the latter's own efforts. The conference condemned the Lewis administration for betraying those Pennsylvania miners in the 1922 strike who had previously been unorganized and who had fought so splendidly, only to be left out of the agreement and forced to continue to work under an open shop. It commended President Brophy of District 2 for having refused to be a party to such treachery, and for his protest against Lewis' action in abandoning these strikers. It then called attention to one of the worst abuses in the miners' union, the appointment of organizers by the LNT president. These organizers were not sent to organize the unorganized, but rather into the various organized districts to play his Lewis politics against his enemies. As a remedy for this evil, which the conference said was eating at the vitals of the whole organization, it proposed that organizers be elected by the membership. The conference endorsed the 8-point program adopted at the February conference, including the demand for the reinstatement of Howitt and Dorchy. It then adopted resolutions calling for recognition of Soviet Russia by the government of the United States, endorsing the work of the Friends of Soviet Russia and the Russian-American Industrial Council, and pledging support to Mooney and Billings, Sacco and Vanzetti, the McNamara brothers, the IWW prisoners and political prisoners generally. It condemned dual unionism and repudiated all dual union attempts, whether these are brought about by the Lewis administration striving to drive progressive elements out of the union, or whether they come from mistaken zealots who believe that the way to strengthen the labor movement is by destroying the old trade unions and starting the whole movement over again on a new basis. 53. The basic demands were nationalization of the mines, organization of the unorganized coal fields, abolition of the appointive power of LNT and district officers, release of political prisoners, recognition of the Soviet Union by the U.S. government, and renewed efforts to establish a national farmer labor party. The Progressive Miners Conference was hailed by Foster as the most significant and promising move yet made in the development of the left wing in the American trade union movement. It had launched the left-wing movement definitely in the heart of the most powerful and strategic union in this country. It had demonstrated the real possibility of unity between communists and non-communists in building a powerful rank-and-file movement in the United Mine Workers of America. 59. Unfortunately, Foster was over-optimistic in his prediction of the prospects for unity of the rank-and-file movement. Although 2 delegates from District 2 attended the June conference, they did so without the approval of John Brophy. Brophy was unwilling at this stage to work with any organization which was aligned in any way with communists. While he respected the communists' seriousness and their tremendous organizing ability, he believed they were bent upon imposing transplanted Russian methods on the rank-and-file movement. Perhaps most important of all, Brophy still believed that a rapprochement with Lewis was possible, and was willing to work with the UMW president in his crusade against the Progressive Committee. A crusade he was convinced would end with the expulsion of the communists from the UMW by the International Executive Board as dual unionists. 60. We will see in our next volume that Brophy later abandoned his efforts to work with Lewis and sided with the communist miners in the Union. But for 4 years after the Pittsburgh Conference, he did nothing to interfere with Lewis' orgy of red baiting. Frank Farrington, the opportunist president of District 12 who had previously been a powerful critic of Lewis on the issue of local autonomy, made an alliance with the UMW president against the Reds, as the Progressives geared up their efforts. Farrington split with Howard over the latter's alliance with Foster, and this weakened the opposition. Despite entreaties from Foster and others, Mother Jones deferred to the advice of William Greene and declined to attend the Pittsburgh Conference. 61. In his analysis of the Pittsburgh Conference, Foster predicted that the Lewis administration would immediately take reprisals against those who attended or supported the conference, would denounce the movement as an attempt of the communists to wreck the UMW, and would even resort to violence, not excluding murders against those who dared to advance the program adopted at Pittsburgh. However, he assured the militants that all such contemptible methods will come to naught. Frame-ups, expulsions, and terrorism cannot stop the progress of the great movement set afoot by the Pittsburgh Conference. The progressive rank and file of the miners are sick to death of the corruption and treachery of their reactionary leaders. They're going to clean the organization from top to bottom. The first conference of the Progressive International Committee of the United Mine Workers of America began a new era in the miners' union. 62. So far as John L. Lewis was concerned, it began a new era in the sordid history of his despotic rule. Dispensing almost entirely with other union business, Lewis devoted the bulk of his time to a systematic campaign against his opponents. He used the precedent established when Alexander Howard was removed from district office by the International Executive Board to seize control of districts and locals opposed to his policies. At the same time, he launched a comprehensive campaign to destroy the Progressive T.U.E.L Committee. International organizers in District 5 were assigned to follow Thomas Myerscough and Alexander Howard and disrupt efforts to organize the Progressive Committee's June 1923 convention. Hired agents infiltrated both the convention and a Workers' Party caucus. They provided the International Office with transcripts of the proceedings and a list of all participants and their affiliations. 63. On June 20, 1923, Lewis issued an official circular declaring the Progressive International Committee a dual organization, despite the committee's repeated opposition to dual unionism. In a sweeping statement, Lewis charged that association with known communists was sufficient proof of dual intentions and banned any boring from within. In effect, Lewis claimed the authority to expel any UMW member who associated with left-wing organizations or challenged the union's leadership. He instructed all districts and locals to expel any union member who participated in the Progressive Conference. 64. On July 11, 1923, Lewis ordered John Brophy to discharge powers. Hapgood and the other District 2 delegate who had attended the Pittsburgh Conference because they treacherously consort with the avowed enemies of our organization and participate with them in their sinister and reprehensible activities. 65. Not a word, however, about the progressive program adopted at Pittsburgh. At the Tri-District Anthracite Convention in July 1923, Lewis launched a bitter attack against communism and ordered 3 communists in attendance, whom he called industrial buzzards, to remove your carcasses without the door. Just outside the convention hall, a group of pro-Lewis thugs severely beat Joseph Manley, Foster's son-in-law, who was an observer at the convention, and one of his associates. 66. Lewis then took a brief recess from his crusade to deal with what has been called the shortest coal strike known in this country. On September 7, 1923, after a strike that lasted only 5.5 days, a new 2-year anthracite agreement, negotiated by Governor Gifford Pinchot, progressive governor of Pennsylvania, was reached, which included a 10% wage increase for day and tonnage miners, a voluntary system of dues checkoff in which union delegates, not management, collected the money, and an 8-hour day for miners working a longer working day. Despite the 10% wage increase, anthracite miners earned less than those in the bituminous fields, and the operators still rejected the idea of a closed shop, continuing to run many of their mines as non-union. 67. Advance heaved a sigh of relief over the brief duration of the strike which, it declared, had it been prolonged, would have produced the cry of Bolshevism and revolutionism. The strike having been settled quickly, the miners are good citizens and legal Americans. 68. But not all miners. Immediately after the settlement of the 1923 strike, Lewis returned with renewed vigor to the campaign against the Progressive International Committee. His red baiting now reached a new low as he issued a report entitled, "Attempt by Communists to Seize the American Labor Movement," that was serialized in 6 installments in a number of newspapers, and even published in the Congressional Record, and was later printed as an official United States Senate document. The report tried to discredit liberal, such as the ACLU, and communist groups working in the labor movement as agents of Moscow trying to subvert American workers in an effort to destroy the American way of life. Subtitled a White Paper on the Bolshevik Threat to the American Labor Movement, the report was prepared by Ellis Sorrells, a Lewis crony and editor of the UMW Journal. Sorrells charged that a communist movement was out to capture control of the unions of the American Federation of Labor, had been underway for 5 years, and that, 3 times in 3 years the Bolshevik leaders, operating through the Trade Union Educational League, have attempted armed insurrection and revolution in the United States. These were the Steel Strike of 1919, the Railroad Shopmen's Strike of 1922, and the Bituminous and Anthracite Strikes of 1922. Even the Heron Massacre was part of the plot. According to Sorrells, standing in for Lewis, the T.U.E.L was being financed by the Soviet Union, to the tune of $1 million, to disrupt responsible trade unions, especially the United Mine Workers, subvert the AFL, and capture American labor for Bolshevism. A special fund had been contributed to the T.U.E.L by the Soviet Union, Sorrells charged, for fomenting armed insurrection among coal miners during the 1922 strike. He blamed the Communists for seeking to expand the strike to non-union mines to bankrupt the UMW, for sabotage in southwestern Pennsylvania, and for planning the massacre of scabs in the bloody battle at Heron, Illinois, during the strike. 69 inches. The American Civil Liberties Union was particularly accused of working with communists in District 2 during the 1922 strike in Somerset County. The ACLU replied that it had confined ourselves scrupulously, consistently and exclusively to the one and only question with which we are concerned: free speech, free press, and free assemblage. New York Times, Sept. 11, 1923. Overlooking the harsh criticism of his presidency of the American Federation of Labor by Lewis when he campaigned against him at the 1921 convention, Gompers announced his hearty endorsement of the campaign being conducted by the United Mine Workers against pro-Soviet and communist propagandists. Referring specifically to the White Paper, Gompers declared that the Union's articles should arouse progressive Americans to the danger that confronts America. 7 degrees. While Brophy did not as yet break with Lewis, he did denounce, although only in correspondence, the suspension of progressive committee members, and rejected labeling, boring from within, as dual unionism. Alex Howard publicly condemned Lewis red baiting as a weapon in the interest of the operators. 71 But Frank Farrington decided to bury the hatchet and abandon his opposition to Lewis. On May 21, 1923, Farrington informed Lewis that unless the real believers in the UMW joined forces, destructive elements would quickly gain control, and the red flag will be our standard. By June, Lewis and Farrington had formed a coalition directed against radicals in the Union, all of whom were labeled communists, regardless of their political affiliation. 72 As Herbert Harris observes, in response to the rank-and-file movements to oust Lewis from his despotic and autocratic rule, Lewis indulged in some of the most vicious and vitriolic red baiting that this whole period of anti-Bolshevik hysteria records. Everyone who fought him was excoriated as a minion of Moscow. 731924 UMW Convention. The battle between the Lewis machine and the Progressive Committee came to a head at the January 1924 convention in Indianapolis, the first International Convention of the United Mine Workers since February 1922. Here the anti-administration forces put up a determined fight. Howard, Hopgood, T.U.E.L delegates and anti-Lewis conservatives all joined forces to mount a major challenge to Lewis leadership. For this purpose, they held meetings to mobilize the opposition to Lewis. At one such meeting, a large number of uniformed policemen were present, and the deputy in charge was under instructions to arrest anyone who made seditious statements. The convention itself was probably the most tumultuous in UMW history. Wild demonstrations by supporters of the opposition, fist fights, delegates swarming into the aisles battling Lewis sergeant-at-arms were regular features of the convention. The outcome of votes on important matters was bitterly contested. 74. The opposition forces demanded the election instead of the appointment of international organizers, the election of committees by the convention instead. of their appointment. The reinstatement of Howitt, the restoration of the Nova Scotia District's charter. The revision of the Union's election system and election, instead of appointment, to fill vacant international offices. 75. In the fight against Lewis' power to appoint Union organizers, the dissenters at first succeeded, in a standing vote of 760 to 743, in stripping the president of his appointive power. Lewis then resorted to a roll call vote in which he announced that the motion was defeated, 2,263 to 2,106. He then simply ignored the cries that the result had been falsified, and retained his appointive power. 76. Numerous resolutions were presented to the convention by locals favoring the reinstatement of the Nova Scotia district, but the Lewis-appointed Committee on Resolutions proceeded to ignore these rank-and-file sentiments, and endorsed the action of the International Executive Board. A number of delegates then took the floor to protest the suppression of the Nova Scotia district's autonomy. Lewis answered that he had acted in a way that only revolutionaries could object to. Sound business sagacity and business sense led me to extricate our organization from the hands of men who had debauched the organization in that field. 77. As soon as Lewis concluded, protests erupted from all parts of the ball, but there were cries of question, and Vice President Philip Murray, who was presiding, put the motion to close the debate. This was carried. The convention then voted and, after a dubious voice vote, Murray announced that the delegates had adopted the committee's report which endorsed the revocation of the Nova Scotia Charter. 78. One resolution was passed that merely stated, "We hereby express ourselves as being opposed to any organization which is in sympathy with the Fosterites, regardless of the name under which they disguise themselves." 79. Tom Myerscough, a communist miner and leader of the Progressives in District 5 of Western Pennsylvania, had been expelled on the charge of dual union activities because of his work in the T.U.E.L. Myerscough appealed his expulsion to the convention, but the Committee on Appeals and Grievances, dominated by Lewis, recommended no change. A delegate thereupon declared that he presumed Myerscough would have an opportunity to present his case from the convention floor. "You may presume so," replied Lewis, "but that won't make it so." When Myerscough attempted to speak in his own behalf, Lewis cut him off and informed him that since he had not been reinstated, he was no longer a member of the Union and so could not speak. 80. When Howitt again attempted to get his case before the convention, Lewis ruled that he was not a delegate and therefore did not have the right to a hearing. He did, however, have the right to a hearing before the Committee on Appeals and Grievances. Howitt and his followers then rushed the platform in an effort to be heard but were stopped by Lewis. Strong-arm men. Wrestling free, Howitt began an appeal to the convention, but Lewis had him dragged from the platform. In the face of loud protests, Lewis adjourned the meeting. About half of the delegates remained in their seats to hear Howitt deliver a lengthy speech exposing the tyranny and policies of the Lewis administration. Lewis was proud to send Charles Evans Hughes, President Calvin Coolidge's Secretary of State, a copy of the resolution he had rammed through the convention denouncing the Soviet Union for seeking to overthrow the government and labor movement of the United States. "I am gratified," Hughes responded, "at this indication of the opinion of the delegates to the convention with respect to the importance of maintaining the institutions of this country." 82. The expulsion of Howitt, Myerscough and other opponents of the Lewis machine was a blow to the left wing. But the T.U.E.L had established itself as an important force in the Union. The T.U.E.L militants had built close ties with other forces in the anti-Lewis opposition. Howitt, who was closely associated with the PIC, remained supportive of Foster throughout 1924, and was one of the few important labor figures to endorse Foster's candidacy for President of the United States that year. He lobbied for the PIC program at the Illinois District Convention of the UMW. After the adjournment of the 1924 convention, the PIC organized a large gathering of delegates who subsequently endorsed a demand for Howitt's reinstatement and the impeachment of Lewis. 83. In August 1924, the T.U.E.L issued a call for support among the Illinois miners and started a campaign of its own against wage cuts and unemployment. One of the key aspects of this campaign was the establishment of unemployment councils. This proposal was immediately denounced by Frank Farrington and his henchmen in District 12's executive as leading to the creation of dual union organizations. But unemployment councils were set up in a number of the district's mining towns, including Belleville, Cesar, and in Christopher in Subdistrict 9.34. Evidence that the uprising against Lewis at Indianapolis was not an isolated event was the fact that the PIC was sufficiently encouraged later that year to nominate 3 candidates to run against the Lewis administration in Union elections. They included George Vosey, a communist miner. After the convention, Howitt was offered the superintendency of the Sheridan mines in Kansas, which would pay about $6,000 a year. Howitt refused the offer and announced that as long as he was connected with the mining business, he would be on the side of labor. Thomas C. Menninger, The Fight of Alexander Howitt for the Right to Strike, unpublished. M.A. Thesis, Kansas State Teachers College, 1946, page 68. In his letter to Mother Jones advising her not to attend the Pittsburgh Conference, William Greene wrote on May 21, 1923, "Work at the mines throughout the Western District is very poor. Many of the members of our union are idle altogether while some others are working 1 or 2 days per week." William Greene to Mother Jones, May 21, 1923, Edward M. Steele, editor, The Correspondence of Mother Jones, Pittsburgh, 1985, page 281. In Illinois District 12, for President, Arlie Staples, for Vice President, and Joseph Nearing for Secretary-Treasurer. They ran on the program adopted at the Pittsburgh Conference of 1923. Vosey secured 62,843 votes for the international presidency, against Lewis 136,209. This was nearly half of the votes cast, indicating that the PIC had become a significant force in the United Mine Workers of America. 85. As we shall see in our next volume, the rank-and-file miners' movement opposing Lewis and his policies was to grow in the years following the 1924 convention and elections, as the forces in the Progressive Committee and the Brophy forces in District 2 coalesced into the Save the Union Committee. But before we leave the dramatic story of the struggle for democratic, militant trade unionism in the United Mine Workers of America, let us listen to a communist tooler. In a letter to Anton Carden, a miner who was studying at Brookwood Labor School in the spring of 1923, J. A. Hamilton of Charleroi, Pennsylvania wrote in part, "We are glad to hear from a miner who is preparing himself for better service in the labor movement. One thing that holds back the progressive movement in all industries is the lack of workers with the pep, ability, training, knowledge. The tendency has been for the natural leaders to rise and desert their brothers. This will stop, of course, as the middle-class ranks become more and more crowded, and as the ideals of true unionism become more widely spread. The program of the Prague Intern. Com. is a reflection of the demands of the outraged rank and file, who in our opinion will at the present time be satisfied with nothing less than abolition of appointive power of officials, also are opposed to trusting conventions to elect any permanent officials. Our view is, that in times of popular upheaval such as is now taking place in the miners' union, the form of government is secondary from the standpoint of getting the proper men elected. The proper ones, and only ones to elect, are those whom the fight against the reactionary Lewis machine brings to the front. These will be elected regardless of the form of election, because if the progressive element does succeed in getting control, it will be only after they have secured such an overwhelming preponderance of opinion among the rank and file that it will be impossible to keep them out of office, and impossible for them to resist the pressure to take office. One of the most radical changes between the present regime and the one that is coming will be a difference in spirit. The present viewpoint of the officialdom of practically all unions is static. Let well enough alone. Avoid any trouble. Don't strike, or if a strike is started, quit before the employers become too much handicapped. Action in opposition to this policy is only undertaken when the rank and file cannot be resisted. But any progressive regime worthy of the name will be militant. On the eve of the election, the Trade Union Educational League warned that Lewis would do what he had done in the past, and namely, win the election, through an ability to count votes in his own direction no matter how they are cast. Miners, protect your ballots. The T.U.E.L urged. Workers. Monthly. December, 1924, page 90. Chapter 14. The Ladies' Garment Workers. It is not surprising, wrote communist journalist William F. Dunn, that the problem of whether to take power and the methods by which it was to be secured, should arise first for the left wing in the needle trades. The needle trades unions, International Ladies' Garment Workers Union, International Fur Workers Union, Amalgamated Clothing Workers of America, and the Millinery Workers Union, are the most advanced section of the American labor movement from the standpoint of political understanding. To prove this contention, it is only necessary to cite the fact that even the needle trades bureaucracy mouths glibly the phrases of social revolution, that in words it acknowledges the class struggle, that at all needle trades conventions, the flag-waving 100% Americanism, which is the hallmark of the rest of the labor movement, is entirely absent. The rank and file, the most active elements with a large mass following, at least have had anarchist and socialist training. There are, of course, exceptions to the above, but it is idle to compare the needle trade's membership with even the most advanced sections of other AFL unions, such as the International Association of Machinists. Such a comparison only serves to disclose that the difference between the needle trades and other unions is the difference between the American and European labor movements. Point 1. The International Ladies Garment Workers Union, ILGWU, was born at the turn of the century. In its early years, it was relatively weak, but it grew rapidly at the end of the first decade of the 20th century during a series of spectacular mass strikes known as the Uprising of the 20,000 and the Great Revolt. In 1914, a group of socialists who had been active in the Union in New York from its beginnings were elected to leadership. Early opposition in the ILGWU. By the end of World War I, the ILGWU had over 100,000 members and was one of the strongest unions in the country. During the war, the ladies, for the mass strikes and their impact on the ILGWU, see Philip S. Foner, History of the Labor Movement in the United States 5, New York, 1980. 226-50, Philip S. Foner, Women in the American Labor Movement 2, New York, 1980, 320-88. 269. Garment industry had experienced a large demand for military clothing for both men and women. This was followed in the post-war period by an unprecedented consumer demand. However, many of the workers who took jobs in the industry worked at low wages in out-of-town unorganized shops, which led to a general undermining of union standards. At the same time, the base of the industry shifted from the large or inside shops to the small contractors dependent upon the jobbers. This change brought confusion to the trade as large shops closed, workers lost their jobs, and the ILGWU faced a loss of power in the industry. A whole variety of shop problems, such as discharges, discipline, working conditions and the use of machinery, went unresolved. A major grievance was the piecework system, under which the union and employer in each shop agreed to a per-unit wage payment. The more the worker produced, the higher the pay, but, as one dressmaker recalled, piecework meant long hours, and where I worked you couldn't get up from the machine to go to the bathroom, or anything like that. You'd always get an argument, you're getting up again. And if you came in late you'd get an argument. The employers, always wanted to chisel you on the price because it was always piecework. Point 2. The onset of the post-war depression of 1920-1921 worsened these conditions. At the same time, many members felt that their union was becoming further and further removed from them. The business agent who served as the immediate link between the worker, the union and the employer covered so many shops that he was unable to deal effectively with the problems in each establishment. The union's immediate representative, the shop chairperson, elected by the workers, could only collect dues and was not able to influence policy. Women members had additional grievances. Although they constituted a majority of the workers in the industry and in the union, they had no voice in the leadership at any level. Few of the business agents or shop chairpersons were women. The ILGWU leadership resolved to maintain its power, regardless of industrial conditions and membership discontent. The incumbents, relying on the disproportionate representation of the out-of-town shops on joint boards and at conventions, resisted all efforts to change. Because of the constitutional and organizational structure of the ILGWU, two locals, the New York dressmakers and cloakmakers, with close to a majority of the garment industry was characterized by three kinds of employers. The inside manufacturers, who owned regular shops that produced finished goods for the market. The jobbers, who did not maintain any shops but purchased material and gave the work out to manufacturers. And the sub-manufacturers or contractors, who maintained small shops with few MacMes. Workers in the industry were grossly underrepresented at union conventions. Those workers who sought to bring about change in the ILGWU banded together to challenge the incumbent officials and to reform the union. Known as the left-wing opposition, this movement arose because, as one group stated, conditions of the labor movement in general and the International Ladies Garment Workers Union in particular created a spirit of revolt among the militant workers, with the greatest grievances arising over the autocratic rule of the union bureaucracies. Other workers blamed the structure of our present organization, which is such that it centralizes the entire control of the organization in the hands of a few, thereby bringing about a state of affairs in which the majority of the membership is uninformed and indifferent to union matters and does not participate in the shaping of policies, tactics, and activities of our unions. Point 3. The first group to challenge the conservative leadership of the ILGWU were the members of Local 25 in New York City. The women dressmakers and waistmakers of that local had been in the forefront of the heroic struggle in 1909-1910 to build the ILGWU into a permanent and viable union. They had fought both the union officials and the employers' efforts to reduce the Protocol of Peace, which had ended the 1910 strikes, to a mere scrap of paper. Even after the United States entered World War I, with the Union leadership supporting the war, the dressmakers and wastemakers led the anti-war movement among the rank and file through their Current Events Committee. In 1917, many of Local 25's members enthusiastically supported the October Revolution in Russia, and in 1919 they called upon the ILGWU to affiliate with the communist-led RILU.4. The early communists were among the most active men and women in the ILGWU, such as Rose Wirtis of Dressmakers Local 25 in New York City and Dora Lipschitz of Local 100 in Chicago. As we shall see, in the struggle against the union's bureaucracy and its policies, the communist garment workers won the support of many rank-and-file men and women who were not communists. The ILGWU leadership, noting that many women workers supported the communists, advanced sexist explanations for that support. For example, the demagogue in the labor union, so it would seem, has a more fertile field for his machinations in those locals where the woman element is large, and we have among us a large number of women, an easily excitable and emotional element, which is at all times quicker influenced by a fiery, tempestuous phrase than by a quietly spoken truth. Rose Wirtis pointed out that, contrary to the generally accepted theory about the conservatism of women, women workers in the ILGWU were always to the front ranks of the progressive labor movement, the first to lend an ear to new ideas and organizational reforms, and the first to raise the banner of revolt against the corrupt leadership in the needle trade unions when the latter abandoned the policy of militant struggle in favor of a policy of hearty cooperation with the employers. 5. Although by 1923 the left-wing opposition in the ILGWU had become identified as almost exclusively communist, in the first 3 years after World War I, it included anarchists, syndicalists, and radical socialists who, along with the communists, competed for the support of the ILGWU membership in an effort to stem the decline of the union's influence. They were united in their effort to reform the union along the lines of the shop stewards movement that was sweeping England, and to reconstruct the ILGWU along shop lines, which meant replacing the craft local with the shop as the basic unit in which all crafts would be united. A conference of 320 wastemakers and dressmakers shop delegates, held in New York City in May 1919, unanimously adopted a manifesto that criticized the existing trade union practice of organizing workers into craft groups, thereby weakening the solidarity of the workers. They organized the Workers' Council movement to advance the shop delegate system in the ILGWU. 6. Late in 1919, the radicals in Local 25 elected a majority of the executive board and moved immediately to institute the shop delegate system. The General Executive Board struck back by moving to split the local into dressmakers and wastemakers locals, both affiliated to a new dress and waste joint board. At first, the reason given was that the local, with its 30,000 members, was too large to be managed effectively, but the real reason soon emerged as the JEB pointed to the role of alleged outside elements, whose actions incited and manipulated internal dissensions. The shop stewards movement gained prominence in Great Britain after 1914, and especially after World War I. While British industry developed and was mechanized, most of the unions remained craft-oriented and unsuited to meet the challenge of the new industrial order. Radicals regarded the union organization as archaic and advocated having the shop stewards speak for all workers in a shop, and not only for a specific craft. Branko Pribicevic, The Shop Stewards. Movement and Workers. Control, 1910-1922. Oxford, 1959, pp. 205-30. See also David Montgomery, The Fall of the House of Labor. The Workplace, the State, and American Labor Activism, 1865-1925. New York, 1987, pp. 415-17. In a ridiculous statement, Stanley Nadel explains the militancy of women workers in the ILGWU as stemming from the fact that, as romantics, they tended to perceive the union officials, who had worked so hard to improve conditions in the shops, as routinized bureaucrats. After all, these officials were not organizing a revolution, and they even negotiated with the bosses. Reds versus Pinks. A Civil War in the International Ladies Garment Workers Union, New York History. January 1985, p. 51. In his MA thesis, Columbia University, 1973, Nadel put it differently. Romantic as they were also realistic in their appraisal of many officials as routinized bureaucrats, and the influence of the current Events Committee spread wide and deep throughout the Union, the Communists and the Needle Trades, 1920-1928, page 16. By some miracle, the realistic appraisal of many Union officials became a romanticized vision. Although Local 25's executive board finally accepted the decision, the battle between the radicals and conservatives continued. During the local elections in the spring of 1921, when it appeared that the radicals were winning the support of the membership, the JEB established a special committee to supervise the election and examine the candidates with respect to their general moral and mental fitness. In June, the special committee found 12 candidates in Local 25 guilty of improper conduct and meted out punishments ranging from 1 year suspensions to 2 years removal from the Union, with forfeiture of all rights and privileges. The left wing correctly characterized the action as the beginning of an expulsion policy. 7. However, this failed to stop the shop delegate movement. 8. The industrial and union problems that had brought it into existence remained unsolved, in spite of the efforts of the leadership to revise the cloak contract, which had been virtually nullified by inflation. In 1921, the New York Cloak Joint Board arbitrarily reached an agreement with the employers in the form of a supplemental agreement, or memorandum, calling for greater productivity on the part of the workers. The union leaders and manufacturers agreed to establish a joint commission which would seek ways to improve the workers' productivity, and it issued its final report on November 1, 1921. The union also agreed to submit to a special appeals committee any grievances brought by the employers against workers for not working sufficiently hard on the job, or, as they put it, soldiering on the job. The union said it would sustain the committee's actions, including dismissal from the job, if a worker's record substantiated the contention of the employer. 9. Left-wing garment workers condemned this agreement, not only because it granted the manufacturers the right to discharge workers for lack of productivity, but also because it could be used to rid the shops of union members whom the employers and union leaders disliked. In October 1921, the left-led Locals 1 and 9 officially denounced the agreement. 101 Garment worker noted later that the agreement gives the left wing a chance to organize and to fight for a more decent leadership. By the time the 1922 ILGWU convention met, a solid block of radicals had organized themselves into shop delegate leagues, with branches in every local in New York, Philadelphia, Cleveland, Chicago, St. Louis, and other garment manufacturing centers. 12. The shop delegate leagues carried on a spirited campaign for the election of delegates to the 1922 convention, calling for rank and file control through the shop delegates, equal representation on all bodies of the international, a procedure for recall of officers, uniform initiation fees, and a needle trades alliance. 13. They also pointed to the union leadership's inactivity in the face of the employer's open shop drive, which had already cost the union a loss in membership. The campaign elected 72 delegates of the total of 233. In 1920, the radicals had numbered less than 1/5 of the 250 delegates. By the time of the 1922 convention, the strength of the left wing had increased so greatly that the three leading conservative officers, President Benjamin Schlesinger, First Vice President Morris Sigmund, and General Secretary Treasurer Abraham Baroff, lost their elections as local delegates. They were seated only as a result of the offices they held. Mr. During the convention, the radicals introduced many proposals designed to make the LLGWU a more democratic union, specifically through the adoption of proportional representation, the shop delegates system, fair assessment rates, and new election procedures. Since proportional representation would have struck at the very cornerstone of the conservatives' power, the small rural locals, they fought the proposal vigorously, and it was finally pigeonholed by referring it to the incoming JEB for action. Julius Hockman, a leading union official, was the only conservative leader who supported the shop delegate system, pointing out that there was a need for a long-felt change of form of our organization. While the other leading union officials feared the shop delegate system, Hockman was convinced that the incumbents could control the reform once it was instituted. Nevertheless, the proposal was ultimately defeated by a vote of 141 to 49. During the convention, Abraham Cahan, the bitterly anti-Soviet and anti-communist editor of the Socialist Jewish Daily Forward, attacked the left wing of the LLGWU and all communists. The convention then went on to endorse the Socialist Party and, over the objections of the left, to donate money to it. Then the leadership rammed through a resolution expressing the convention's wholehearted indignation and resentment against these malicious intermeddlers and disruptors, and warns our men and women in our organization against these sinister influences which are not aimed for their benefit, which have not their true interests at heart, but which are seeking to destroy and demolish what has been built at so much cost and sacrifice. Although the shop delegate system had been rejected by the convention, the issue was far from dead. Even though President Schlesinger remained in office and the General Executive Board was re-elected, the major questions facing the LLGWU, the shop delegate system, the changing producing forces in the industry with the rise of the jobbers, and the growth of non-union labor, all remained unresolved. The leadership had refused to consider any proposals that might threaten their power and was confident that it could contain the left wing through expulsions and suspensions. 15. Its confidence was strengthened when the anarchists split with the communists over the latter's refusal to support a resolution calling upon the Soviet government to free political prisoners. The anarchists thereupon withdrew from the Shop Delegate League and became strong supporters of the ILGWU administration. Saul Novoski, the anarchist leader, became the editor of Justice, the chief ILGWU journal, while Rose Posada, another leader of the anarchists, became the union's only woman vice president. 16. Growth of T.U.E.L influence in the ILGWU. In 1923, the communist movement rose to a commanding position in the battle for the support of ILGWU members against the leadership's policies. An important factor here was the triumph in left-wing circles of a trade union policy that emphasized the need for struggling within existing unions for progressive principles. According to Rose Wirtis, before 1923 the left-wing movement offered a solution for many of the problems facing the needle trades workers, but was doomed to failure because, instead of acting as a propaganda group, it aimed to replace the union. Wirtis was referring to the fact that the Shop Delegate League spurred the formation of a T.U.E.L section in the ILGWU with its demand for militant industrial unionism, militant action in the struggle for higher wages, shorter hours, and better working conditions, and the amalgamation of craft unions into broader-based units. The left wing in the ILGWU affiliated with the T.U.E.L in 1921.1. In 1922, the needle trades unions, with their radical memberships, many of whom supported the Russian Revolution, became a major focus of T.U.E.L activity. On November 22, 1922, a needle trades section of the T.U.E.L was organized. The idea of a united body of workers in the clothing trades was not new. The Needle Trades Workers Alliance of America, promoted by the Amalgamated Clothing Workers, had been established late in 1920, uniting the unions of the ladies' garment workers, the men's clothing workers, and the hat, cap and millinery workers. Sensing that such unity promised to bring greater strength to the clothing workers, the employers denounced the alliance as a one big union, which, as un-American and unpatriotic. The influence of Lenin's left-wing communism and infantile disorder was an important factor in this change. While conceding this, although he labels it, taking their orders from Moscow, Stanley Nadel argues that the left wing of the ILGWU were also adopting the familiar Socialist Party strategy of boring from within. Nadel, Reds vs. Pinks, p. 54. However, David Sapis, a leading student of the labor movement in the 1920s, observed of the socialist policy of boring from within. Where the socialists remained in their unions, they busied themselves in preaching socialism and urging support for the party, only incidentally criticizing craft unionism and the other industrial and economic policies of the conservative leaders. David Sapis, What Lies Back of Poster, The New Turn in Radical Trade Union Tactics p. 4, David Sapis. Papers. See also Philip S. Foner, History of the Labor Movement in the United States, 3, New York, 1964, 387-92. However, they had no real reason for alarm. The alliance was only a loose federation, which did nothing but hold occasional meetings, and by June 1921, its secretary, Max Zuckerman, conceded that in no sense was there a real alliance of the needle trades unions. The alliance expired early in the fall of 1921.18. The November 22, 1922 meeting of the representatives from the ILCWU, the millinery workers, the capmakers, the journeyman tailors, and the fur workers of New York was attended by 40 delegates, all of whom were members of the shop delegate leagues. The meeting made it clear that the battle of the militants would be conducted within the needle trades unions, and that no attempt would be made to replace these unions with new ones. In addition to attacking the policies of the incumbent officials of the needle trades unions for sacrificing the interests of the workers for the profits of the employers, the T.U.E.L sections program dealt with some concrete proposals for solving the major problems of the needle trades. Sub-manufacturing that moved part or all of the production process to non-union areas, and the development of the jobber, whose presence represented a constant pressure driving down wages. The program proposed that the unions make the jobber responsible for conditions in those shops performing his production, and to accomplish this by organizing all the shops working for one jobber into one shop committee. The program went on to maintain that the only way for the union to deal with the out-of-town problem was to organize wherever the employers moved to escape the union. No single union had the resources to carry out such an organizing drive, therefore, the program urged the amalgamation of the various needle trades unions into a single industrial union organization. The meeting also called for affiliation to the RELU and active support for the Soviet Union. The T.U.E.L needle trades section, after pointing out that women workers in the needle trades had started the ball rolling with a demonstration on March 8, 1908 in New York, which led 2 years later to the establishment of International Women's Day on March 8, urged that the same date in 1923 be dedicated to rebuilding militancy and democratic unionism in the needle trades unions. 19. At a subsequent conference held in May 1923, the needle trades section of the T.U.E.L endorsed the Jewish language newspaper Freiheit, and also independent working-class political action. 20 inches at the International Socialist Congress in 1910, Clara Zetkin, the German Socialist Party leader, moved that the day of the demonstration of the American working women, March 8, become an International Women's Day, and that March 8 each year be dedicated to fighting for equal rights for all women in all countries. Under Zetkin's leadership, the first International Women's Day celebration was held in Copenhagen, Denmark that year. Philip S. Foner, editor, Clara Zetkin, selected. Writings, New York, 1984, pp. 108-09. In the battle in the needle trades unions, the right-wing socialist leadership had the support of the Socialist Party which, although it had been weakened nationally, still exercised influence among Jewish workers, and of the Jewish Daily Forward, with its large circulation, as well as that of its bitterly anti-communist editor, Abraham Kahn. The T.U.E.L had the support of the Workers' later Communist Party. In 1922, Jewish communists began publishing the Freiheit, a daily newspaper, edited by Moise Olgin, which consistently attacked the right-wing leadership of the needle trades unions. The Worker, and after January 1924, the Daily Worker, proved invaluable in mobilizing wide support for the radical garment workers in their struggle to carry out the program of the T.U.E.L. 21. This program was especially attractive to the workers in the garment industry, particularly in New York and Chicago. Many of them were socialists. They had been active in the post-war shop delegates movement. They were more favorably inclined toward industrial unionism than other unionists, even though the structure of the needle trades unions was based on craft unions on the local level, and they were admirers of and in sympathy with the Russian Revolution, both because of their interest in socialism and because the revolution promised an end to the oppression of their people, the East European Jews, in the country they had left behind. To these factors must be added the fact that the workers in the needle trades were becoming increasingly restless because of the worsening industrial conditions and the autocratic, class collaborationist policies of the socialist leadership of their unions. The T.U.E.L answered their needs, with its demands for the amalgamation of the craft unions into industrial organizations, for the organization of the unorganized garment workers, and for the recognition of Soviet Russia by the U.S. government. 22. As the T.U.E.L's program for social and industrial change came to attract more and more garment workers, LLGWU President Schlesinger came under increasing pressure to launch a campaign to destroy the movement. Schlesinger vacillated, apparently not having a stomach for the kind of battle that was being urged upon him. Finally, on January 13, 1923, he resigned and was replaced by Morris Sigmund, who was determined to act decisively to eliminate the left wing. The attacks against the T.U.E.L increased, but the organization nevertheless continued to grow. In the 1923 elections, the T.U.E.L won a majority of the seats on the executive board of Local 22 and of the Philadelphia Joint Board. It also won a dominant influence in the executive boards of Locals 1 and 9 in New York and Local 15 in Philadelphia. In addition, it gained a strong foothold in the Chicago locals and threatened the administration's hold on the Chicago Joint Board. The Sigmund administration went into action to reverse these setbacks. In the spring of 1923, the JEB, citing its constitutional power to bar members from joining dual unions, warned those workers who were aiding any radical groups to cease their activity. It then proceeded to establish a committee to investigate the activities of all left-wing leagues. After brief deliberations, the committee concluded that the left was led by outside radicals who employed devious methods to subvert the ILGWU. When the new executive board of Local 22 was to be installed in June, the old board refused to step down, claiming that the left-wing majority of the new board were members of a dual union, the T.U.E.L, and therefore were not eligible to serve. The decision was appealed to the T.U.E.L, which undertook an investigation, after which the old board's action was sustained in full. 23. In July 1923, the T.U.E.L announced that it was placing the highest priority on ridding our union of this pestilence. No more dilly-dallying on this question should be tolerated, as it was clear that our union could not endure half loyal and half disloyal. Louis Penkin, business agent of Local 10, later told an interviewer who asked him what he thought of these procedures. "Well, the democracy was a little bit shattered because of the fight between the communists and the members. We had to sort of stay away from the demands of democratic rules. You had to in order to save the Union." 24. Beginning of the anti-left crusade. On August 10, 1923, Justice predicted that the group of destructionists will be driven out of the Union. There was, it declared, no alternative. Our International will not allow these reptiles to stay in the Union and undermine it from within. 6 days later, the T.U.E.L, charging that the T.U.E.L members were undermining the very foundations of the Union and are its enemies, directed all locals and joint boards to order their members to desist from all activities in the leagues in any shape or form, and warned workers who continued as members of these groups that they would be brought to trial on the charge of conduct detrimental to the organization and would face expulsion from the Union. While the directive was also aimed at other opposition groups in the Union, it was clear that its specific target was the largest and most influential of them, the Trade Union Educational League. 25. So few locals complied with the directive that on September 29, 1923, the T.U.E.L made it clear that the August ultimatum was not merely a SUG. One is reminded of the United States general in the Vietnam War who said, "We had to burn down the village in order to save it from communism." Hestion to the membership, but a definite order that must be complied with unconditionally. If a local was not satisfied with the decision, it had the option of appealing the ruling to the next convention or disaffiliating from the Union. If it refused to comply, it would face reorganization by the T.U.E.L. 26. In Chicago, 2 women members of the Chicago Joint Board were charged with belonging to the T.U.E.L and with attempting to direct the affairs of the Union through caucus meetings planned and carried out by this league directed by persons not belonging to our Union. A trial committee appointed by the Joint Board brought in a majority report of not guilty and a minority report of guilty. The board approved the minority report. The 2 workers, after being called upon to resign from the T.U.E.L, refused and were expelled from the Joint Board. 27. One of them, Dora Lipschitz, insisted that they had been expelled simply because they had dared to speak for policies which we believe to be necessary for the best interests of our organization. The administration's response was that the expelled members could be reinstated only if they declared publicly that they accept the policies laid down by the present officers. In a letter to President Sigmund, the expelled members replied that they were ready to go to great lengths to strengthen the Union, but they were not willing to surrender the inalienable rights of the rank-and-file membership to propagandize for amalgamation, for the Labor Party, for the shop delegate system, and other measures associated with the left wing. For us to agree to any such demand would be treason to the labor movement. We will never agree to any proposal that involves such a violation of the fundamental principles of unionism. The expelled members' statement concluded. We were expelled because we advocated the program of the left wing. While methods of advocating this program may be made a matter of discussion, we feel that it is useless to further discuss our right to advocate the policies in which we believe. We are ready at all times to meet with you, with any members of the General Executive Board, or with committees from any part of our Union, to work out ways and means of restoring unity in the organization upon this basis. Whatever may be your action in the matter, we will continue to fight for the interests of the workers in the shop, and we confidently expect to retain the esteem of these workers in the future as we have in the past. Asterisk. The action in Chicago was soon emulated elsewhere. When 19 left-wingers in New York's Local 22 refused to quit the T.U.E.L, it was at a meeting of garment workers in Chicago's Ashland Boulevard Auditorium on August 27, 1923, protesting the expulsion of the members of the Chicago Joint Board, that 3 gunmen burst into the hall and tried to assassinate William Z. Foster. More than half of the audience was made up of women affiliated with the ILGWU. The gunmen were never apprehended by the police. CN 50, p. 385. Expelled from the local's executive board and barred from holding office in the ILGWU for 5 years. Not only were 14 of the expelled members women, but they were replaced by 18 men and 1 woman. 29. Some locals tried to resist the purge orders, but they were informed that if they did not change their policy, they could be excluded from the International. In Philadelphia, locals 2 and 15 voted to defy the administration edict, and their charters were immediately revoked. 30. The rationale for the attack on the T.U.E.L was that it constituted a dual union and the ILGWU Constitution prohibited membership in a dual union. In the Chicago case, ILGWU Vice President Meyer Pearlstein argued that the 2 expelled officers had attended secret caucus meetings that elected a slate of candidates for business agents in the local elections and discussed union business. To Pearlstein, this constituted dual unionism and was therefore sufficient ground for the expulsions. 31. It was a weak argument. Advocates of dual unionism conventionally called on workers to leave the old unions and join the new dual unions, and they attempted to negotiate wages and working conditions. But the T.U.E.L made no demands directly upon the employers, it carries on no negotiations with them, it signs no agreements with them. It collected no dues, chartered no locals, and called no strikes. Moreover, the Trade Union Educational League is flatly opposed to dual unionism, believing that radicals should prevent rather than encourage splits in the union movement. The League was exactly what it claimed to be, an opposition movement within the established unions. As such, it naturally discussed union business and endorsed candidates for office. League members were targets of attack because they advocate ideas that endanger the right wing's control of the union, and because the rank and file of our membership, suffering great hardships, is beginning to place confidence in us. The left wing vowed continued opposition to the officials, who, they charged, planned to return the workers to sweatshop conditions through collaboration with the employers and the ultra-conservative AFL leadership. 32. The T.U.E.L did make a serious effort to resolve its differences with the ILGWU's leadership. In October and November 1923, at the direction of the T.U.E.L's National Committee, Foster wrote to Eugene V. Debs, asking him to intervene in the ILGWU conflict, informing Debs that the state of affairs in the ILGWU is now a desperate one. The reactionary officials who opposed industrial unionism, Soviet Russia, and many other principles long advocated by U, are trying to expel the left wing, which they cannot meet in fair argument. Foster denied that the Trade Union Educational League is a disruptive organization, and asked Debs to do what he could to halt the expulsion of T.U.E.L members from the ILGWU. In April 1923, as we have seen, Debs had offered an unequivocal endorsement of the T.U.E.L. Now, in his reply, Debs noted that there were many conflicting statements about the nature of the unfortunate controversy involving the expulsion of your members from the LNT-Emational. Ladies garment workers, it was essential, he declared, that the controversy, which menaced the interests of the organized workers, be settled before further disaster follows. He proposed that a committee of union officials and one representing the T.U.E.L meet and try to resolve the controversy. He indicated a desire to attend such a conference so as to learn the truth about the situation concerning which only the most conflicting reports have come to me. Asterisk. Foster informed Debs in reply that the T.U.E.L's National Committee welcomed his proposal and agreed with him that a stop should be put to this matter before further harm is done. The committee was convinced that such a conference could only produce good results, and recommended that it take place in Chicago, where the committee was situated, so that there will not be too much expense. It expressed the hope that Debs would arrange to attend. This time, however, Debs indicated that previous commitments and the state of his health would probably prevent his being able to be present. I am not at all my normal self, nor have I been since I left prison. In any case, he still thought the conference was an excellent and necessary step and suggested that Foster propose it directly to the ILGWU officials. If they agreed, and if the conference was held, and if it is possible for me to be in attendance, health and other conditions permitting, I shall, if desired, gladly render any service in reaching the desired end in my power. 33. Foster thereupon wrote to President Sigmund, on behalf of the Trade Union Educational League, proposing to you that there be a conference arranged between representatives of your organization and ours, at which the general question of the controversy over the League shall be considered. We make this proposition in all good faith, hoping that a way will be found to end the deplorable situation. We trust that you will accept. At the same time, Foster made public the correspondence between Debs and himself in his letter to Sigmund. In his study, William Z. Foster, labor organizer and communist, Edward P. Johanningsmeyer discusses the Foster-Debs correspondence, but he does not mention Debs's proposal that committees of union officials and the T.U.E.L meet to try to resolve the controversy. Ph.D. dissertation, Columbia University, 1988, pp. 594-95. Debs had been convicted of violating the Espionage Act by opposing American involvement in World War I. He was sentenced to 10 years in prison on September 14, 1918, and incarcerated in the federal penitentiary in Atlanta, Georgia. He was pardoned by executive order of President Warren G. Harding on December 23, 1921. The White House announced that Debs and 23 other political prisoners would be released on Christmas Day. He told the press that if Sigmund refused to agree to the proposed conference, it will demonstrate beyond all question of doubt that his charges against the League are fallacious and that he does not want a settlement except by the destruction of the left wing. It will prove that the real basis of the attack against the League is not that it is a dual union but that it carries on a militant campaign for amalgamation, a labor party, and other progressive measures that are obnoxious to the Gompers bureaucracy. 34. The only answer from the ILGWU leadership was a continuation of the expulsion policy. Chicago's Local 100 was placed into receivership and new officers appointed to replace those expelled on the charge of being T.U.E.L members. 35. In the fall of 1923, Louis Hyman, a spokesperson for the left wing, although he was not a communist, 36 summed up the situation in the industry as one of severe crisis, characterized by low wages, the return of the old piecework system, widespread unsanitary conditions, and shops employing only 5 or 6 workers. Submanufacturers, operating in an extremely competitive market, were slashing their costs to the bone by running substandard shops that undercut wage scales and lengthened the hours of work. However, unemployment was the greatest problem, and the existing collective agreement was to no small extent responsible for this. Under the reorganization clause, employers were able to discharge workers at the beginning of each season, with the result that in some shops they fired up to 50% of the workforce. Moreover, employers had a free hand in discharging workers on such vague grounds as incompetency, misconduct, insubordination in the performance of work, breach of reasonable rules, and soldiering on the job. 37. Even the Union administration admitted the deteriorating economic situation, and with great fanfare, announced a 10-point new industrial program, dubbed the 10 Commandments, designed to combat the severe decline in working conditions in the industry. The union program demanded a 44-hour week with union wages and conditions in all shops with 14 or more machines. It proposed that during the slow season, the jobber should divide the work among his submanufacturers who should do the same for their workers. The jobber would be allowed to deal with only 5 outside shops at one time and could engage additional contractors only after all his submanufacturers were working at capacity. Most important, the jobber was therefore to be considered the actual employer of labor, responsible for working conditions. 38. The 10 Commandments died stillborn. The cloak jobbers simply refused to accept responsibility for wages and working conditions. At the end of 1923, Justice, in its annual review, described the year as a period of unusually hard times, long slack and economic and moral depression. 39. The 1924 Chicago strike. In the winter and spring of 1924, the ILGWU was involved in a general strike against the dress manufacturers of Chicago. The strike, launched on February 27, 1924, had as its aims a 10% wage increase, a 40-hour week, and collective bargaining in the industry. 90% of the 3,000 strikers were young women, and they put up a heroic fight. 40. Before the strike began, many Chicago women members of the ILGWU urged Meyer Pearlstein, the union's vice president, to restore the expelled members to full membership so that they could contribute to the struggle. What are we going to do without Dora Lipschitz, who in strike after strike has given every ounce of energy and every minute of time to leadership in the strike, and who now is expelled and not even allowed in this hall? One of them asked. Perlstein rejected their appeal, but Dora Lipschitz, speaking for the expelled members, declared that they would nevertheless support the strike unequivocally. The T.U.E.L endorsed this position, and black T.U.E.L members in Chicago began a campaign to force Negro employment agencies to sign agreements not to send scabs to shops on strike. In a letter to Negro churches in Chicago, these league members, signing themselves, a committee of colored strikers, wrote, "The greatest blow to the cause of the strikers at this moment is the constant stream of non-union colored girls who are now being brought into the shops to defeat the strikers. These girls are being supplied by various colored labor agencies on the South Side. This is unfair to the union girls of both races, and it is the thing that has contributed more to the state of antagonism existing between the two races today than anything else." The committee urged the black clergymen to advise your congregations not to aid the employers to defeat the union by sending colored girls to take the jobs of the strikers. It was able to report success in this campaign, including a pledge by the Urban League of Chicago not to furnish scabs to the dress manufacturers. The very day the strike began, Judge Dennis E. Sullivan issued a sweeping injunction against any form of picketing. Over 500 women strikers were arrested for violating the injunction, and jail sentences of from 15 to 50 days were handed out to 90 of them. Meanwhile, police and private thugs freely attacked the women strikers. State Attorney General Crow worked openly with the manufacturers' lawyers, even assigning police attached to his office to strike duty. In a letter to Crow, President John Fitzpatrick of the CFL said, "We had hoped you would have some regard for womanhood, and that there was some limit at which you would stop in your desire to serve the interests of unfair employers. But we were bitterly disappointed." 42. At the end of the first week of the strike, Mother Jones, en route to California from New York, stopped off in Chicago long enough to speak to the girl strikers. "This strike of yours is war. It is damned real war," she told them. "You girls are fighting, and I want to tell you to keep on fighting. Don't care about police in or out of uniform. Don't care about jails, courts, or injunctions. Picket, strike, fight." Then she declared, "You girls should get the entire labor movement of this town behind you. They can help you. Get them to do it." 43. Women strikers appeared before the executive session of the CFL's Committee of 15 inches to appeal for support of their strike. If the strikers submitted to the mandates of Judge Sullivan, they told the committee, the strike was lost. On the other hand, if they insisted on their right to picket the shops that refused to settle, the strike will be won. Late in April, almost too late to be of much help, the CFL did appeal to all Chicago unions to aid the garment strikers. "These women strikers are making a great heroic fight," the Committee of 15 declared. "Do something now to help them." 44. But while the strike dragged on and women strikers continued to be fined and jailed, the leadership of the ILGWU was devoting all its attention to the battle against the left wing at the convention scheduled to open in Boston in May 1924. By the time the convention met, the Chicago strike had ended in defeat. 45. The 1924 ILGWU convention. The left wing ran candidates for delegates to the ILGWU's 1924 convention wherever they could, but the inequitable representation system favored the small locals controlled by conservatives, and once again ensured right-wing domination of the convention. For example, a local union of 21,000 members had 13 delegates, while 7 locals of 7 members each 49 people in all had 14 delegates. 46. The Credentials Committee, led by Joseph Bressler and David Dubinsky, recommended that the convention refuse to seat any delegates elect accused of being members of the T.U.E.L. The convention supported the committee on every one of the challenged delegates, even when the challengee denied having ever been a member of the T.U.E.L or maintained that he or she had resigned. Local 25's Rose Wirtis, a leading communist, was alleged to have remained in the T.U.E.L until March 1924, resigning only to gain eligibility to run as a delegate to the convention. Speaking in her own defense, Wirtis explained that the Trade Union Educational League is not a dual union, and added, "I do not think that the decision of the General Executive Board was for the best interest of our industry." She said that she had resigned because it was not possible to be active in union affairs and still be a league member. The convention nevertheless voted to exclude her by a vote of 185 to 40.47. As in previous conventions, the left-wing delegations proposed a system of strict proportional representation on joint boards and at conventions, and the adoption of the shop delegates system of organization in the locals. Both proposals were rejected by the convention. In fact, rather than democratize the Union, the right-wing leaders instituted a series of measures that placed even more control of the Union in the hands of the GEB and the President. The list of offenses was expanded to include acting to the detriment of the interests of the ILGWU by slandering the organization or its officers. The JEB was given explicit power to revoke the charters of or reorganize recalcitrant locals. All JEB orders had to be complied with fully, and the board had final authority to interpret the law according to its plain and obvious meaning. 8. The 1924 ILGWU Convention adopted a constitutional amendment barring from membership in the Union anyone holding membership or office in a dual union or in any other organization not constituted or functioning within this Constitution. 49. That formulation neatly sidestepped the problem of whether or not the T.U.E.L was a dual union. The conservative leadership emerged from the convention with greater total control over the union structure. The comparatively large left wing in New York Locals 1, 9, and 22 were now under right-wing control and loyal to the policy of eliminating the T.U.E.L's influence. Most of the left-wing strength in the outlying districts, Boston, Philadelphia, and Chicago, had been eliminated by the removal of elected local leaders. 50. In New York, the situation was now ripe for a major strike against the cloak employers. The areas of conflict were the establishment of a union label, a minimum yearly employment guarantee, an unemployment fund, a 40-hour week, and increased minimum wages. The union got nowhere in its efforts to achieve these demands without a strike. The Employers Protective Association not only broke off relations with the union, but even abolished its labor department. This led Justice to lament. In the last 5 years, conditions in the cloak industry have been going from bad to worse and they have now become well nigh intolerable. 51. The rank and file, by a vote of 31,483 to 449, voiced its desire to strike, but the leadership, fearing that a long strike would bring with it a resurgence of radical activity, agreed to the formation of a fact-finding commission appointed by Governor Alfred E. Smith to study the situation. The commission's recommendations formed the basis of a settlement. It recommended that all shops employ a minimum of 14 workers, that all work be done by union labor, and that an unemployment fund be established into which the employer would pay an amount equal to 2% of his weekly payroll, while the worker contributed 1% of each paycheck. The commission rejected the union's request for a 40-hour week, higher minimum wage scales, a provision that there be a limitation on the number of contractors used by each jobber. Even though President Sigmund acknowledged widespread rank and file unhappiness with the recommendations, he fought the left-wing demand that the proposals be rejected. After a bitter debate, the overwhelming conservative majority adopted the report. Thereupon, Morris Hillquit, counsel for the ILGWU, wrote to Governor Smith that the credit is due primarily to your personal intervention. However, Paula Elliott, in her study of Governor Smith, concedes that many members of the ILGWU did not share Hillquit's satisfaction with the agreement. 52. The union continued to lose membership, down from 94,000 in 1920 to 61,000 in 1924. By that year, too, the jobbers controlled approximately 75% of the market. The result was increased unemployment and shorter work seasons. Another result was that although the right wing seemed to be in secure control of the union, the continuing economic dislocation in the industry, the packing of the 1924 convention, and the changing of the Constitution proved, as we shall see in the next volume, that the right-wing victory was a Pyrrhic 1.53.